So when we finished up, we were talking about making the case. And as we were coming in, I was talking with a gentleman, and he said, you know, this kind of feels like when you're in Shark Tank. And he's saying, you know, it's like when you're on Shark Tank. And I said, you know, it absolutely is. The same sort of case that's being made when those people are trying to get investments are the same questions that you're answering right here, right? Why? Because there's competition for funds, right? Major donors are hearing a lot of different messages. Annual donors are getting a lot of asks, and so they've got to figure out which one of these organizations stands out. Because if I think that's right, deserve to be invested in, because if you look at if you look at donors, the average donor supports 6 to 9 different organizations. Okay, 6 to 9. Now here's what happens with these, though. So they've got 6 to 9 organizations, and they give donations, and then they weed out all but about the top 3 normally, and replace those with others. What might cause an organization to be weeded out? I'm sorry? Follow-up? Lack of communication? Lack of dedication? Relevance? Yeah? Accountability? Credibility? Yes. Not following the directions is a legal issue. So that's an even bigger issue. Oh, in terms of grant funding, yes. In terms of grant funding, not following the directions absolutely is the kiss of death, if you would. And so they're replaced. So remember I told you that the average gift is usually between $20 and $25 if you look overall. That's what an average is. Now, it's kind of interesting because when I've done some other research where large organizations were saying, we need to figure out, you know, how can we best find these major donors to give really large gifts. And so I looked at their files and I said, you could buy all the zip code demographics that you want. You know, if you're rich, then you might live in this area, those sorts of things. That tells you capacity, or in our chart it said ability, right? But it doesn't tell you anything about interest, and it doesn't tell you anything about linkage, right? Yeah. So how I normally talk about that outside of fundraising, as I would say, it doesn't tell you anything about passion. It only tells you capacity, right? So what you'll find is that a lot of people will actually give those smaller gifts, and then they'll come back, see how they're treated. And I've literally looked at files where $25 was given, and then $65,000 was given, or more, a lot more, 6-figure, a lot more. And what they're basically doing is just, let's see how the organization treats us. Let's see whether or not they value this gift. Let's see how they steward me as an individual. Let's see how they steward the gift. They're looking at those things. So we are constantly in competition, and I thank you for raising that, because we're constantly in competition for funds, and that's the whole reason that we're going through this whole process, right? So as we move forward then, we've already done this example. Just notice that there is a case section in your book that I think in that book it's still section chapter 2.1. It'll say something about case statements and forming case statements. And just know that that section's there. You don't have to go to it right now, but I want you to identify the fact that when you're talking about a case, you can go back to the book and look at it. It'll have some different information than I'm presenting here, but it'll still give you some supplemental information. So we've gone through the cycle. And in the cycle, when we think about the thank yous, the number one reason that people don't give again, just notice that there's an acknowledgement section as well in chapter 13. So you might want to just write that in where you see on the cycle the recognition. Someone uses my same bark. So, and I'll have to tell you, mine went off one time when I was speaking at a really large conference. And so now I judiciously turned on the sleep mode for my phone. So I get it. So that's it. Chapter 13, we want to make sure that you are aware that is there, and also want to make sure that we talk somewhat about some of the vehicles that we have for giving, right? Some of the vehicles that we have for giving. Of these things that are listed on page 38, thank you. Oh, 28. Those things that are listed on page 28. Which one do you think is the most, which one do you think is the best, the most effective? Personal solicitations. Personal solicitations. Okay? Because the personal solicitations are one-to-one, face-to-face. I can talk to you and read your body language. I can hear exactly what you're saying. I can connect with you as an individual. I can see if the chemistry is right. If we look at section 5-3, it talks about the face-to-face request. You'll just want to kind of make that note in there. That's actually number one. Well, why don't we always just use solicitations, personal solicitations? Yeah, what kind of limitations? That's right. We can't be everywhere. Could be geographic limitations. It could be budget. I don't have enough budget to get to everyone. All those sorts of things. That's when we start having things like direct mail come in. So if I tell you that personal solicitations are best, and we talk about direct mail, what type of direct mail is best? Dear sir, ma'am. Dear valued member. Yeah, putting in the name and personalizing as much as we can. With every word processing package, you don't have to do anything fancy. You can pull in, that's right, you can mail merge in the name, the address. You can really even mention the last thing that they've donated to, right? So having come from a direct response and a direct mail background as well, I'll just share with you that when you're writing a letter, that you want to be as personal as possible right at the top, right? It's always best if we can also have the personal address on the envelope because it matters. It increases the open rate. It's a little bit harder because then you have to either match mail, which is normally what you have to do, meaning you have to find the letter that matches with the envelope that was addressed correctly and put them in, so it's a little bit slower process. But that's a process that you can get your board members involved in, the church, the Pathfinder group involved in. Anyone could do that matching, right? So you want to do that because the only other alternative is to have a window, and you don't really want to do that, not for solicitation, okay? The next thing about direct mail that I want you to think about also is that you want to be laser focused. One ask, very focused. There's one thing you want people to do. And so I tend to like to thank people up front, right? I tend to ask them to do something that everyone could do, like continue to pray for us or to please pray for us, because that's an easy yes I can support. And then I'll move into problem resolution. That's advertising, right? You watch ads on TV. They show you a problem or tell you about a problem, let you experience it, then they talk about the resolution, right? It's the same thing you're going to do in the body, right? You set up the problem very briefly, one paragraph, and then you come in with the solution right at the end of that same paragraph. You go to the next paragraph, and you can explain more now how you're best suited to address that or how you're uniquely suited to address the problem. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes.
You're talking about the letter itself.
Yes.
Okay, the letter, and you said, what do you start off with?
So when we're starting off with the letter, we want to start off with a salutation that's going to be personal. Like, not dear Michael. No, I always laugh when telemarketers call my house and I'm going, if I don't know your voice, yeah, we're already off on a false start if you're trying to act like you were my friend, right? So we want to have a personal solicitation. Then we want to move into setting up the overarching structure. And I want to get people to do something where they can participate and it doesn't really cost them money. Prayer is a good way to do that. That's usually the way that I lead into it, really, is prayer, because and I always want to bathe everything in prayer anyway, right? It's the thing I left off of that cycle, but to be honest with you, I would tell you that that's at the beginning of the cycle and it's at every step throughout the cycle, right? But so we start off with the personal address. We move in then to something that everyone could do. We move from there into problem resolution. Set up the problem in a paragraph. At the end of that paragraph, talk about how you can resolve that problem. The next paragraph then, we're moving into expected outcomes and how you're going to do your work. And then we want to end with a signature line, right? And in that signature line, believe it or not, it's best to sign that in blue. And yes, there are research studies that study all of that stuff. Blue signatures, that's why you see that a lot. And it's much better if there's actually a physical signature, which is why you've seen companies move to things like genuine pen that looks like signatures. I mean, it's gotten to the point when I was still doing direct response that I could go through and they would say, tell me what your client's handwriting looked most like. And I could flip through a book and it would get down to a point where it was most like that, right? So they could have something that would look like that was signed. In our cases, we can actually sign that physically, right? You can have board members sign that. It's a good way to engage them, right? They do, but it needs to look like my signature, though, right? And the ones that come for free that look like signatures don't really look like signatures to the human eye. Those are really pretty expensive to do, and that's why they usually only do them at the end of the year in large organizations. But you don't have to do all that, right? Because you're not trying to mail to 60,000 people, right? So you can actually physically sign in what color? Blue. In blue. And then we want to end with a PS, the postscript, right? PS. And when you end with that PS, you want to reiterate what it is that you want them to do. Thank you in advance for your support of. It's going to help the community to, or these people in the community to X, Y, or Z. No more than like 2 lines, not another full paragraph. And you want to end there because when people read, they check to see if their name is right. They scan any major sections, so if you can bold something in there to kind of to let people know where you're going, that's great. And they look at the PS, and then they decide whether or not they want to read the rest of that wonderful copy you labored over. Okay. Yeah. And it matters. Different people are different. To be really frank, the question was how much is too much? Sometimes, most times, the letter is going to be 1 page. 1 page. Sometimes you'll have a 2-page letter. For more involved subjects, I can tell you that when we did things that were more political in nature, some of those are 4 pages. And people are reading those things. So it all matters, but that's why you want everything to be scannable no matter what, right? Because you don't know who's on the other end of that. And you do some testing to figure that out. Do you really need 4 pages, or are you just going on and on and on and on? So, was it Mark Twain that said, I would have written you a shorter letter had I had the time? Right? Because it's easy to just throw it all out there, but if you have to edit it succinctly, that takes some time. So 1 to 2 pages for sure, probably 1 page.
No, I want to ask it. You give the thanks in the beginning and the end? The thanks?
Oh, absolutely. And we can say that differently. We appreciate your support of. We're very grateful for your partnership in. Those sorts of things that are still really thinking. But yeah, I tend to like to do that, and when I had writers writing for me, I would just tell them to write it that way and would re-edit it because I know that people may not get to everything. And that thank you at the bottom won't make any sense if they haven't really read this. So I'm trying to put it into context really quickly. That we're grateful for you. Here's an easy way for you to participate. Here's what we're doing right now. Thank you for your support. Oh, and by the way, don't forget, we really need your support. Okay? Okay? Yes.
We are moving away from letters. We're going online, doing email. Do we do a pyramid, basically we're doing copy, right,
Yeah.
for these letters. So
Yeah.
difference now with everybody going online and email, and we know email marketing is really good. People open the email, and when they can recognize who's sending the email. So what's your advice on those?
Yeah. So here are a couple of things that I heard in that question. One is implicitly, should we be moving away from print to email? Well, the question I'm going to ask is, that's right, who are you trying to reach? What do those people, how do they want to be touched? What are they most likely doing now? There's a reason why most direct response, meaning you make an ask and you want people to do something, most direct response marketing is actually done in the mail, in snail mail. And yes, it does cost more, but we can be very judicious about who we're sending to, right? So it doesn't have to cost us an arm and a leg because, again, we're not mailing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. So the first thing is more money is raised in direct mail, far more money is raised in direct mail. And so that's the first piece. And the response rates tend to be higher as well. And for acquisition mailings, where you're trying to get brand new donors that you didn't know before, absolutely. That's happening more in direct mail than it is in emails that are direct response emails. Some of the things that happen, pick it up, I could read it later, right? What happens if you don't read something in your inbox 5 days later? What's really happening with that? Yeah, that's when I start deleting, right? I'm reading it in my viewing pane, which is getting to what you asked, the second part of what you asked. I'm not even opening the email. Well, guess what? When you look at your metrics, then you don't even know that I have looked at it because you don't pick up when I'm reading something in the pane. You know what I mean when I'm saying the pane, right? That's right. So you want to have the message and the same principles right up front. You've got the personalized information right up front. You've got some kind of thank you, here's where we're going. Next paragraph, I mean, you use it in different windows. Open it up and look at the size of your browser window. Here's another thing. You go online. Well, actually, what's really ubiquitous now in the US? Meaning what's everywhere? So this is what we have to be optimized for now, right? Because now when I'm reading my email here. Now when I'm visiting your website, the number one way for me to get to your website really and truly is here. And if it's not optimized for the phone, meaning that the designer actually built it for the phone, it's called responsive design. If your website's not responsive design, and I'll be really honest and tell you that it's one of the things that I'm sharing with my department, is that I said, if you look at it online, it was built for the computer. It wasn't built for the phone, so it doesn't change the menus automatically and make sure the type is big enough, right? So even if I turn it sideways then and I get a bigger view, that's right. So those are things you have to think about when you're thinking about mail versus doing that in email. Now you may say also, well, younger people, and I'm coming right to you. You may say younger people though. We're targeting younger people, and the younger people are online, right? And you do have them online, and the studies have come back. If you go to the Direct Marketing Association, the studies have come back time and time again that those folk often are also looking at mail and maybe actually purchasing or giving online. So the two work together. Integrated communications. Does that help? Okay.
We can send it to ourselves before send it to someone else to see how it looks.
Oh, absolutely. Great idea. Always test it to yourself, test it to other people. Use multiple browsers, Internet Explorer, Safari for the Macs. Yes, Fox, thank you. You know, I mean, you want to use different browsers and open it up just to see what it looks like. And you have to think about those things when you're sending something electronically, you know, an email, especially if you have images in there, because they'll shift and look really weird. Yes?
You mentioned that we should thank people first and then give a direct ask that everyone can accomplish. What are examples of things other than saying, like, would you please pray for us if you don't want it, if the audience isn't maybe religious or, you know, just to other ideas?
If the audience isn't religious, then I usually will skip that point and go right into the ask. Because for a religious audience, when I look at things, to me, fundraising is stewardship. My job is to make the opportunity available to people and to let them know what that opportunity is and to ask them and invite them to participate. So as a Christian, I always put that up front. So when I joined that agency and we had Christian clients, at the beginning of every letter, I was like, nope, put it in right at the beginning because I want their decision to be baked with prayer, right? Above and beyond that, there's not usually going to be an easy way. There are other types of involvement devices that do some similar things where you may ask people to do a quick survey. That's why they do those things. You may ask them to check out the boxes on. You may ask them to do a pledge of support for. You may ask them to share this mini postcard with someone. Those are all called involvement devices. So anything that I can do to get you engaged in doing something that's not a huge ask, that's easy for me to do, is always good in direct response marketing. Okay? Good point. Okay? So, with that, we've got some other things on here that we're going to go through really quickly. In-kind gifts. What might those be? Not quite small gifts. Services, equipment, things that are given in lieu of cash. Cash. Are those things a waste of time for us? No, because it's the things that we would have spent cash acquiring that we can now keep, right? And so if you look in that book, I talk a little bit about in-kind gifts as well, and I'm pulling together a webinar that I'll do for PSI on in-kind gifts. But this is a great source. This is a great way to be able to get a business partner online. We're needing Dell Corporation, we need computers. They're building new computers consistently, right? So those are great places to go and get those sorts of things. Furniture companies. There are all sorts of things that can be gotten. Someone was talking to me about creating a house for women that have left prostitution or trying to get out of prostitution and need to be retrained. And so you could imagine the things that they need, right? When they're pulling together a needs list, well, we need refrigerator, we need beds, we need, stove. You list all those things out. And then you think, okay, now I can go to Home Depot, let's say, and get some of the materials we need to paint, some of the lumber, those sorts of things, right? Now, should I go to the corporate? Remember, that type of philanthropy coming usually from a business, sometimes people will give their time, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But when we're going primarily to businesses, they're making a business decision. For you, it looks like philanthropy. For them, it's absolutely a business decision with a return on investment. So they're looking for everything we talked about before in terms of the case, all of that stuff, right? But now think about this. Home Depot has a home office and they have a local office, a local store. Which one do you think it's best to go to? Okay, you said the local identifies with you? They're part of the community doing that function? Uh-huh. Yep, that's right. And to not belabor it, I'm going to say that's exactly the thing. Oftentimes people will say, so we're going to send the letter to headquarters, and what's going to happen with that letter is, at best, they're going to send it back to the local branch because it's the local store that's trying to make an impact and show that they're good community partners, right? So start local, then go national. Okay. Oh, good question. Best time to do in-kind gifts was the question. And actually, it's year-round. Had a friend, believe it or not, for Bible Bowl, I walked into a restaurant, saw a guy that I knew from New Orleans. We were in band together, and he said, you know what? I always have to give things away, and I see all these posts you do with Bible Bowl. Why don't you fill out this letter? And every month, those restaurants are doing something, and they've planned out usually at least 3 months in advance, right? 3 to 4 months in advance they're planning out. So you'd want to get those things out probably 6 months in advance. So there's time in the system, right? Sometimes a local office has to approve it, but you're doing that on an ongoing basis. So $600 a year I was able to give to the kids that were studying as incentives for them to eat at like the Cheesecake Factory. $50 gift certificates and $25 gift cards. Just by a simple letter, and they're doing this on an ongoing basis. Target, when you're walking into your local stores from now on, start paying attention to what you see on the walls. Target will have things up talking about how they support the community. Walmart has things up talking about how they support the community. Walk-in restaurants, especially locally owned restaurants, will talk about how they're supporting the community. Some people have said, don't they have to give away dollars? No, it's a business investment. They're giving away dollars because they want to be good community partners so that more people come in. Well, even more than the tax write-off, they do get that, but even more than that, they're really trying to show that I'm a good corporate partner and I care about the community. I'm one with you. Please be one with me. But yes, they do get write-offs, you're right. And I'm glad that you mentioned write-offs because oftentimes with individuals, people will think, well, the most important reason that they're giving is for the tax write-off. But if we think about what happens with taxes, so I give $100, and let's say my tax rate, what, 28%. Do I get to take $100 off my taxes? How much of that 100 do I take off? 28%, $28. So it's not the driver, but it's an expectation that absolutely, I'm expecting to have this receipt, I'm expecting to be able to take this off, but there's something more driving me to make that sort of an investment. That's a good point, thank you. And so that's in-kind gifts. Any other questions around in-kind gifts? Okay. This is probably the area that's the most neglected when we think about raising funds, in-kind gifts. Cause-related marketing. That's where you have people coming in and they want to put their name on something, sponsor something. You've all seen races where you've got sponsored by, that sort of thing. They want to link with a cause. But I've also done some other things. When I did some stewardship things, I said, I wanted some resources to be able to hand out to the community as we were doing training on personal finance. So what type of organizations do you think I started thinking about that might be able to help with that? Banks. And the granddaddy of all banks, the Federal Reserve, I called them and I said, you know what? I noticed that you have a curriculum that you've already developed for classrooms. Can I swing by the Dallas office and pick that up when I lived in Dallas? Great, they mailed it to me. I moved here. Same thing, right? We're going to do community outreach. I called them. Can you send it to me? They expressed it. I told them how many people we were going to have at the event. I told them the purpose. I let them know that the church is sponsoring this event, but it's open to the community at large, and that it's a community outreach program. They paid to express their materials to me so that I had materials to use in Columbia, Maryland, in the DC area. So that's the kind of things that we want to start thinking about in terms of, and I wasn't even offering them sponsorships. It was really more this, right? But I've done things where I had sponsorships. If I have a large event, you want to put banners up or you want to put them in promotional brochures, et cetera. But the reality is they know that that advertising is very limited. That on an event, they're going to be lucky if there are 1,000 eyeballs that are seeing their ad. So that's not really the reason that they're doing it. Somebody had a hand up. Yes.
What kind of course were you dealing with?
So I was doing some financial things where I wanted to teach people how to do personal finance. Personal finance. And so I went to them. But you could go to local banks, do the same thing, right? Get resources. You're doing a health fair for something. Where would you go for a health fair? Who would you think about? Hospitals. What else? Pharmacies. Yeah. Department of Health. Doctors. Insurance companies. I was in Nigeria, and it was insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies that were supplying the drugs that we were taking over to Lagos and Abuja to do this health fair there, right? So good. And then, of course, we have special events. Everyone's familiar with the special events. The grants we're going to talk about, and we'll talk about grant proposal writing. There's no magic bullet here. It's all those other things that we talked about before. But I'll let you know some things that PSI does to also help to support, okay? And then when I talk about combined campaigns, what I'm really saying is, in some instances, you're running the annual campaign. In some instances, we're running the capital campaign. Those are the two most major ones. You can also do special projects, so you can kind of think of it as projects. Annual campaign, capital campaign, or special projects, like debt reduction, or you just want to buy some special thing, right? A combined campaign says that you can run a capital campaign in conjunction with your annual campaign, so that you're talking to the same people about both at one time. Because the concern oftentimes is, if I start talking to them about they've been a great supporter for the annual campaign. And in our pyramid, we talked about wanting to move people up into major okay. So they've been a great supporter for our annual campaign. When I start talking to them about the capital campaign, are they going to stop supporting the annual campaign? The only way around that is to talk to them about both at the same time. That's what a combined campaign is, okay? And that's the most you really need to know about that. So we're looking at annual giving here. So make sure that you look at chapters 4 to 7 when you're thinking about this sort of stuff, what's in the toolbox, and chapters 10 and 11, which are going to deal with alternative revenue sources. It's one of the chapters that I have in there. And debt, raising money for debt. It's going to cover those things, okay? Yes. So chapters 4 through 7 and chapters 10 and 11. 4 through 7 and 10 through 11. You're welcome. Okay? And now we land on capital campaigns. And capital campaigns are campaigns for what types of things again? Buildings, equipment. Yes, anything capitalized. Good. Chapter 8 talks about capital campaigns as an additional reference. So the first thing we want to do with a capital campaign is we need to figure out, is it even really feasible? You know, if I have someone telling me, oh yeah, we're going to build a new gym and we need $3 million to do that, my first question is, oh, that's great. How's the annual campaign going? I'm asking that because I'm trying to figure out these sorts of questions, right? I want to know, are people already investing in the organization? They find it worthy to invest in the organization? You know, I know what you said you want to raise. Church told me, you know, we're going to do $52,000 in 52 days. And my question, of course, is, so how much have you raised in general now, right? Those sorts of questions versus perceptions versus realities. So it looks at all these sorts of questions, not to say you can do a capital campaign or you can't. Do you have enough donors? Do the donors think well enough of you? Do they understand the case for support? Is the case for support relevant? But a feasibility study is a formal study, right? Sometimes people will call it a campaign study. It's a formal study where a small segment of the donors, of the prospective donors, are surveyed to find out whether or not they're really going to buy into this big vision that you have for the capital campaign. Okay? From our standpoint, outside of, you know, building a new school, that sort of thing, we should do a feasibility study on. Internally, you can kind of look at this and kind of internally assess for yourself whether or not people are really going to buy into a capital campaign that you may be doing on a smaller scale, let's say for a bus or for something like that, a van, a mobile van to deliver healthcare, all those sorts of things, right? It'll look at who should be heading the campaign, just a ton of questions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because you can just read these. And the reality is probably 99% of the people in this room are not really going to need to do a feasibility study because most aren't doing like building a school, right? But if you have to, the more money you have to raise, the more you really need that feasibility study, okay? Capital campaigns are large goals. They have very large goals. You have a defined period of time that it runs over. When you're asking people to give, you're usually asking them to give a very sacrificial amount. So it's something that they can't give at one time. They usually give those gifts over a couple of years, usually over 3 years, but it can be more. There are 5-year campaigns, there are 7-year campaigns, but usually people are doing 3-year campaigns. What they usually are not doing is asking for the entire gift right now, okay? Because most people aren't walking around with that type of disposable income just ready to give away, right? They have to do some planning to do that, okay? Chapter. Can I use your book right here? Is this one yours? The tabbing may be off. There's going to be a tab that says, I'm saying off. Remember, I've referenced I'm always referencing the newest one. We work from a couple of different books, and so I was thinking you were going to have the blue one, and I referenced everything to that. So we're looking for one that says capital campaigns, yes. And in here, it is chapter 5. Thank you. Yep, chapter 5. Okay. So it's very volunteer-driven. You usually have committees. It deals very highly with face-to-face solicitation, and it goes through all of the stuff that we first started with. Looking at those circles, thinking about how we could identify prospects, what's the linkage, the interest, the ability, who are we going to assign there so that we can make a pitch to them, what project makes the most sense. All of those critical questions really have to be answered when you're dealing with a capital campaign. So the first thing we do is we look at ourselves and do a needs assessment. That's why we said an internal test of readiness. You know, what do we want? Why do we need it? What can we afford? Should we have a consultant? We already talked about the fact that a consultant won't raise the money for you, but will guide you in raising the money, right? Teach you how to make asks, teach you what the structure should be, encourage you to set up those committees, help you to think about what the policies and procedures probably need to be in place. And then one of the most important things is fundraising capacity. You know, are we able to really raise 5 to 7 times the amount of money that we've raised before? Right? So when I have someone saying, well, we need to raise $1 million, and I say, what are you raising annually right now? And they say, well, right now, you know, our highest year really has been, about $50,000 or $60,000. There's going to be an issue, right? And the worst thing that could happen is that you go into a capital campaign and it stalls and you have to try and kickstart it, right? So we want to try and avoid that by pulling the goal down. How could we do that? Maybe we break it into phases. We were just talking about the church and saying the church needs to do some other work in addition to the elevator. We're saying, well, you could always phase that and talk about the campaign in 2 phases. That's why you see that, okay? When we look at the various steps, we get into preparation, and so we've got the feasibility studies that we're doing. We're training volunteers, we're writing policies and procedures, all of those things that we've been talking about. We're writing our plans. All that development cycle stuff that we talked about before is happening in here, and we move forward. And then we start producing things like letters of intent. Has anyone ever dealt with a letter of intent? What, and help us understand what a letter of intent might be. A letter of intent will be a letter that's kind of like pledge cards. Yeah, so it's a letter that says, okay, I've talked with this person and they're planning to give this type of a gift, right? And so they're intending to give a certain gift and you want to outline that. And for that gift, I may have promised to do some things like name a building after them, name a section after them, those sorts of things. So all of that is outlined in the letter of intent so that it's clear to each of us. Now, is that a binding contract? No. Right? Okay. So letter of intent and pledge cards are used over multiple years. We have acknowledgments. When people pledge, do all of those people actually fulfill after they make a pledge? No. No. You'll have drop-off. You'll probably have 30% drop-off on a good day.
You may not fulfill the pledge, but at least maybe start giving somebody towards the pledge.
That's right. They may not fulfill the entire pledge. They may start the pledge and not finish it. They may forget and not give any of the pledge. They may have some financial issues and fall off. We may forget to remind them that they actually made the pledge. I'm dealing with that with a church right now that just did a really large campaign, and I said, okay, so tell me about your pledge fulfillment procedures and what were you doing to make sure that the pledges are fulfilled? You acknowledged them, but you acknowledged them when they made it. Well, they hadn't done anything between when someone said, yes, I'm going to give, and they filled out pledge cards, in between that, they didn't remind them. What we'd want to do in a capital campaign is send reminders out. Reminder letters, phone calls, emails about things that we're doing and thanking them for the pledge that they've made, right? And we don't count it as money until the money is in the bank, right? Okay. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You definitely want to say, remember, it's not a contractual relationship, and so it's a spirit of gratitude, not bill payment, right? And so, to your point, though, yes, you want to say in writing, thank you so much for supporting this project. Your support will mean blah 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 for these blah 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 blah, and we appreciate your pledge of $300. I'm too tired to do math right now. $360, let's say, over X number of monthly payments, that sort of thing, so that they remember, because really they're getting a lot of mail. They may not remember what they pledged, right? Yeah, so we do that. You can also do phone calls, and phone calls are very helpful when you realize that you've been sending out pledge fulfillment letters, is what we call those. When you've been sending out pledge fulfillment letters and you realize that they still haven't sent in a payment, they're getting behind. If they get behind 3 payments, you're probably going to really be at risk of that thing totally just dying right there, right? And so calling them and reminding them, hey, just wanted to touch base with you, not sure if we missed something in the mail, we didn't have in record where we saw that you had given this, we know you pledged this amount, and just wanted to remind you if you've forgotten, or please forgive us if we have made a mistake and our letters have crossed in the mail, is a common phrase, right? Okay. Then we have gift acceptance policies. Do we accept gifts from anyone and everyone? Is it okay for the local casino to give, or is it not? And I can't say yes or no. Well, and some people will say no way, and some people will say absolutely, cattle on 1,000 hills, and Lord owns it all. It's in the wrong hands. Your organization will really have to make that decision, right? That's why you need the gift acceptance policy. And these are serious things too, because there have been some Adventist institutions that have been supported by, let's say, Indian tribes that were very thankful for the health message, and that money is coming in from where? Right? And so the question is, do we utilize that or do we not? I could also go into Scripture and say, well, when the children of Israel were coming out of bondage, that's right. He said, they told them to plunder the Egyptians. There's not a right and wrong. It's really prayerfully consider it and just understand that people may be very sensitive to certain types of donations, may be very sensitive to things like, are we really going to name a building or anything else after someone that's still alive and can still really mess up their name? Or do we only name after people that have passed away? If we name, what happens if the husband and wife divorce? Do both names stay on? Do we change the name to the new names? Those are all things we start to think about, right? Because people are really serious, not because they're like, oh, well, I just want my name on a building. That may be it. They may just want to leave a legacy. They may want their grandchildren to know that this thing is important to them, that feeding the homeless is so important to Grandpa that he gave this. And they support it so well that they did this. They named a building after him. So those policies are important. And you just think through them as much as you can, and you move on from there. So when we're doing a capital campaign, we have basically 4 phases: a silent phase, a public phase, a wrap-up, and a celebration. The silent phase is where we're going out to individuals that we've identified on that spreadsheet where we looked at linkage, interest, and ability. We're going to those folk, and we're asking them to support. And this says, this is a really broad range, 30 to 75%. You'll get numbers all over the board. I would tell you that if you are not able to raise at least 50%, 50 to 60 is the numbers that I usually use. If you can't raise 50 to 60% of your capital campaign goal in the silent phase, I can pretty much assure you that you're going to need to readjust your goal. And you want to find out before rather than after, right? You find out before by doing the feasibility study and start in thinking about who is it that may give and starting to talk with them about projects and seeing how interested they are. A lot of the work is being done here. We're going to talk about a gift range chart. I'm going to show you one. But in the silent phase, we start raising a lot of money because people want to give to a capital campaign after it's a moving train, right? They usually don't want to start doing the heavy lifting of pushing the train out, right? There are some people that want to do that, and those are the major donors. That you're not asking for $100 or even $1,000 really from them. You're asking for a lot more than that. Then we move into a public phase after the train has already left the station, right? So in other words, we don't start off saying, we're going to run a capital campaign in order to create a new wellness center. And look, we've just put the thermometer up here. And you've seen the thermometer, it starts at 0. And then 3 months later, it's at 0 or pretty close to it. And you keep going and it's at 0, and now your campaign is stalled and people think this is never going to happen. To name drop? Meaning, tell me a little bit more about that. Name drop in what way? Mm-hmm. If Walter agrees that you could use his gift to spur on other gifts, absolutely we want to do that. But he has to agree to that. And you all want to know Walter well enough to know whether or not he's comfortable with that. He's probably most comfortable with that, and he probably doesn't want you to know the amount that he gave. But he's probably most comfortable if he's also, when you've talked to him and you've asked the question, are there other people in your circle that you think might be interested in this type of a project? Considering this type of, this person, which I know you also know, would you mind if I mentioned that this project? Softer terms like that, we have your support? Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Yes?
In the cases where there is a name drop, is there anything you got any concern about? When you're like, okay, if, let's just say a document where Walter would sign saying that, you know what, it's okay for you to use my name.
Yeah, that you really won't have to worry about that because one, you're going to keep all donor information confidential, so you're not going to really be talking about amounts that one donor gave to Speron. You're going to say that. Right. And these are public donations, and you'd be surprised the amount of information you can get because of public donations, right? Meaning it's reported, and it's open to public inspection that these donations came from legal sources, and they're named. So it's not illegal. We're really doing it because you want to make sure that you maintain a good relationship and that people understand that you're trusting and that there's a sense of confidence around giving it. But no, you won't have to worry about policies around that sort of thing. So then we go into the public phase, and that's where you're soliciting everybody under the sun that you can possibly solicit. If they breathe and they're even tacitly close to the organization, you're talking to them. Then you want to wrap up, and at that wrap-up period, that's where you're making sure that you've gotten most of your pledges are coming in on a consistent basis. We're really excited. We're in year 3+. Because if you pledge 3 years at the end of a 3-year process, or in a 2-year process, and maybe you've been actively soliciting for a year and a half, you can see that that timeline can shift from 3 years to out to like 5 or more. And then you have a celebration phase. You know, the big, ooh, this is great, ribbon cutting, all of that kind of stuff, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So we go through and we look at these different types of solicitings where we're looking for the leadership gift, which is the biggest gift that we need. And we're looking for other advanced gifts, the other very, very large gifts at the top of the chart. And we move on to general gifts and cleaning up. So not going to spend a lot of time in each of these, but campaign preparation, you've got to have all of these items. We need to have our mission down. We need to have our vision. We need to know what the campaign purpose is. We need to make sure that we're thinking about how we're going to cultivate the donors. We're thinking about volunteer recruitment. We're thinking about who should be on the prospect list. How are we going to cultivate those? And that generally takes 1 to 6 months, okay? 1 to 6 months. So if someone's coming and saying, we're going to do a capital campaign, and they're saying, oh, and I say, when do you need the funds? And they're going, oh, we want to build the building as soon as we can, brother. We need to do it in 3 months, 6 months tops. It's not going to happen, right? They're going to have to break it into smaller chunks, but it's really not going to happen. So for a major campaign, these are the things we've got to do. It'll take 3 to 6 months to do the campaign planning, where we're looking at all of the committees that we may need to pull together. And we're thinking about the feasibility of our doing this project and making sure that our case is very tight and that we've got timelines that are established and that we've written our policies and thought about what our campaign goal really is, because we've gotten real numbers from architects and everyone else, or whatever the numbers we need if it's not a building. And that we have a gift chart that we're really working from, which I'm going to show you in a minute. Okay? 3 to 6 months. Yeah, and I may have added some additional, this is a living, breathing document for me always. So I could have added some steps in around some of the other things, which I did. Tell you what, when you send it to me, just remind me to send you those additional steps, and I can do that. How's that? To email me and just let me know that you need these additional steps for the capital campaign. If you're not in a capital campaign right now, I'm not sure you're really going to want that or need that. And then in the second phase, we're looking at building committees. We've got public relations committees, making sure we have our budgeting done, finance. We've got budgets made to actually fundraise as well. Looking at how we're going to cultivate prospects, who are we going to link with those prospects, and thinking about what types of events we're going to have, right? And then it'll take another 2 to 3 months to start looking at the leadership gift phase, where we're looking at the prospect list, and we'll talk about these ratios later. And that we think about who's going to solicit and how we might want them to solicit. What might that script look like? What are the main talking points? And do we need to prepare some individual proposals because we've got a really, really large ask that we're going to make, where we want someone to fund, a quarter of the project, half the project, it may be the whole project, right? And that we're training volunteers at that point and soliciting other gifts, and that we're recruiting family gifts, that inner circle that we talked about moving outward, right? That's 2 to 3 months, okay? And then we're thinking about our advanced gifts. And we're doing the same sort of thing. We're reviewing our prospect list again, because new people can constantly be added. We're going through similar sorts of steps. We're continuing to train volunteers rather. And then getting ready to move into the general solicitation. So we've got to recruit the general solicitors, right? So that when we go into the general phase and we're asking for those funds, then we're ready and we're reviewing the prospect list, going through the same sort of thing. We have a huge campaign kickoff at that point that's going to be very public, because now we're into the public phase, right? It's here when we're into the public phase. We're on step 5, and now we're public, right? But we've been raising money before that. It just hasn't been public, right? And that's where we may throw in things like phone-a-thons and direct mail and website and media and everything that we could possibly do to create as much awareness as possible. 3 to 6 months is what we're talking about there. And then we've got celebration and cleanup. And that's where we're following up on the solicitations, right? We're making sure that volunteers are acknowledged. We're making sure that we've thanked donors appropriately. We're sending receipting out for donations that have come in, or pledge fulfillments that have come in, right? And we're continuing to reinforce those donor relationships. That's another 12 to 36 months. Okay? Yes?
Question. It seems like this is public information. Is it okay, and I've seen it on one side, that the organization posts a list of all of their donors and the amount on their website, so you can go there at any time and see?
Yeah. When they post, when organizations, the question was, is it okay when organizations post all of their donors on the website so that it can be seen, really to spur on other people that may give? That's often done when you've broken things into sort of giving clubs. So you've got varying amounts. So if you think about a classical example of, like, let's say a symphony or something like that, they're breaking those things down. But the donor's not surprised that their name is listed in the bulletin or wherever else, right?
No.
They're being told beforehand.
Yeah. But
And so that's fine, but you want to let them know. Now, you want to do let's put ourselves in that basket. So you've just made a really large gift, and there are a lot of needs in your church. Do you want your personal information out there? So now it's not a legal question that we're really dealing with, right? It comes down to what's my relationship going to be? But suppose that I'm doing something where I'm in the silent phase, and I say, as we said before, well, we've talked with some folk, and the head elder Brown is really, really excited and really on board with this project. As a matter of fact, he suggested that I talk with you. Using the name in that way is going to be far more beneficial. Okay? So it's not that we can't list it, it's that you probably shouldn't, and you definitely shouldn't if you haven't gotten their permission to do that. And if you're going to list that amount of detail, you probably want to put that in writing and let them know exactly where you're listing it. Now, where do you normally see those sorts of things? Maybe a donor wall where they list out, like glass plates or metal plates or something like that, leaves off of a tree, all those sorts of things. The $5,000 to $10,000 donors, they're still giving ranges. So people don't know, but they're giving ranges. You can list it out on things like that. Okay? And that would be part of our gift acceptance policy, right? And so it should be clear to the donor and clear to the organization, because the policy, remember, was in existence before we started asking people for money. We talked about doing those policies early. Okay, good question. Okay. Gift range charts. I'm going to come right back to that. This is just kind of a visual of, we've got general donors, advanced gifts, and leadership gifts, right? And you'll look at chapter 15 to think about the legal aspects of those sorts of gifts. But yeah, this one we're not going to, I want to go straight here, which is actually the gift range chart. Now, in the back, it's probably hard to see some of those numbers, right? The room's a little deeper than I was thinking it would be. So when we look at this gift range chart, this is a nice chart, not just, on page 33, this is a nice chart not just for capital campaigns, although it's essential to have this chart for a capital campaign. These are also nice if you're doing other types of fundraising, whether it's an annual campaign or you have a special project. It's a good way to make sure that you're continuously thinking about growing your donors and your donor base and the health of your file. And so what happens here is we say, okay, we've got $1 million campaign, and so we've got to have these level of gifts that we're going to be asking people to give. And the higher that top number goes, $1 million campaign goes to 3 million or 5 million, this number gets a lot bigger, right? This lead gift, right? The lead gift may be $500,000 or $250,000, right? $250,000, $500,000, something like that. It's a good checkpoint for us to go, now wait a minute, do I really know people that can give at this level, right? If I don't, the first thing I will always tell people is break it into phases, get the numbers smaller so that all these numbers will be smaller. Get a quick win so that you don't have a project that's been dragging on for 5 or 7 years and people are saying it's never going to be built, we don't want to put any more money into it. Get a quick win, right? But it tells you the types of dollar figures that you were looking for. Now, there is a link that I will send to Dr. Kwan for him to send out to the group that has an automated gift chart. It doesn't make the numbers nice and pretty and round like this. It's really kind of crude. But Blackbaud, B-L-A-C-K-B-A-U-D, one word, is the company that makes Razor's Edge. But Blackbaud, if you go to their site and you just put in gift calculator, as a matter of fact, if you Google gift calculator, Blackbaud's probably going to come up first. You can put in a campaign goal and it will flesh out some of these things. I'll tell you, it's not perfect because you really do want rounded numbers. You don't want to tell someone you need to raise $13,323.99. But it's a calculation and that's what's going to happen on that thing, right? PSI can help to pull together things like this if you're running through a capital campaign and make sure that we're rounding those numbers out. But this is the way that it works. So we see the number of gifts that we're going to need. on the far left corner, far left column, right? And then we've got the gift ranges, the amounts that we're going to be asking people for. And then we've got this prospect ratio, right? In other words, I'm saying that I'm going to need 8 gifts at $15,000 level. Does that mean I only need to ask 8 people? No, that means 100% of the people are saying yes, right? What we're saying is, over time, basically you've seen that you probably need not just 4, but 4 equally good prospects that you really felt would say yes in order to get one that actually does say yes, right? Same thing here. I need how many gifts at 60,000? And how many prospects do I need? And how many of those do I think are going to convert? 1. Okay, so that's what these ratios are in these parentheses, right? This is the total number of prospects that I'm going to need in the end. And you notice I had 3 prospects here, 3 prospects here, because that was at 3 and this 3, right? So then I've got 6 total prospects, and 6 and 6 is 12, and 12 and 12 is 24. 24, you see what's happening? So this is telling me how many people I'm really going to need to raise this, right? And when you get down here into this level, especially, that's really the mini. 600 and below, definitely mini. You won't always need this number of people, but those upper parts are really, really important. As a matter of fact, the more great prospects you identify up here, the less important this is, but everybody feels like there's a sense of community we pulled together to get this project done. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's how these numbers are coming out. And in terms of our totals, then this is just the amount that we're raising. So if I've got one gift at $150,000, of course it's 150. I add these together, it keeps working like this. Here I got 2 gifts at $60,000. That's why it's 120, right? Because it was 2 times at 60,000. And we just keep adding these things together. So all we're doing really is looking at how many prospects do I need to have, because I need to know that I have enough people to ask to support. And then I'm looking at how much money am I raising as I start working down this gift chart, right? Because we don't work from bottom up, we work from top down on this, right? And then you see the percentages of the totals that we needed until we hit $1 million, right? So not as confusing as it might have looked at initially, right? Now this chart is essential. This chart is where I've been able to walk in and I'll say, okay, you know, I inevitably get a call, oh, we're going to run a capital campaign. I'll go, great. Are you already in the midst of the campaign? Yes. So now I know that it's probably a desperation call. They probably haven't hit the numbers that they needed, and they're in the middle of a campaign. So then I'm trying to figure out things like this. Do you have enough prospects really to be able to ask for the funds? Are you asking for funds at the right level? How are the funds going to come in? So then my direct question to them always is, do you have a copy of the gift chart that you all are using? And if they say they don't have one, I just take it as that we're starting from ground zero or even further back, right? You've got to have this chart. I can't emphasize this enough. A feasibility study, I go, it's important, it really is important, but we may not have that. If you are running a capital campaign with no gift chart, you're heading into trouble, okay? So that's what this chart is used for. Now, we already talked about making a list of people based on abilities, right? Now you can see where this starts to feed things downstream, right? It's not just who are we going to talk to first. It's did we have anybody at the $150,000 level? Or things like real case scenario, dealt with a school that said, hey, you know what, we're on a $9 million campaign. I said, okay, $9 million. Let me see the gift chart. Look at the gift chart. When I looked at your figures, it said the largest gift you received was a good gift. It was $500,000. Except the gift chart said that you needed to have a gift that was sitting at I can't remember, I think it was somewhere around 2.5 million. So immediately I'm going, you know you're going to have to revise your goal, right? Oh, no, we're going to make it. Well, in the end, this chart almost always wins, right? So it's not a bad thing because it can help us to understand what really is our likelihood. Are we really ready to start right now? Or do we need to revise the project so we can have a smaller goal? Or do we need to spend more time building these relationships? When people are giving at very large levels like that, you may be working on those sorts of relationships for many years, like 10 to 15 years. Or $1 million unless something happened and the Lord just moved immediately and they did that. He's always moving. But you've got to work, and oftentimes those relationships have been worked on for a long time. They've been long-standing members of the church. They've been in for quite some time. They're very passionate and are blessed to be at the point to be able to give. So, any questions on this gift range chart?
So before you start the project, you should count the cost and using this after.
Absolutely, and I love that you quoted Jesus when you said, count the cost. That's right. That's right. We want to count the cost and start doing this. And you can do this not with just capital campaigns. You know, you're trying to raise $50,000 for Pathfinders. Make a gift range chart. Say, okay, we're going to go after X number of gifts at this rate, so that you have a systematic way of knowing that you're on track. This becomes kind of a smart objective that's walking, right? I mean, you know whether or not you've raised enough money at that point. So we always want to do this, but especially in capital campaigns. Do we need to take a break? Okay. Can we get a mic right? It's going to be easier. Hold on a second. So we've got a question. Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, how much of our ministry budgets we're able to allocate toward kicking off philanthropic campaigns? Because I know my church doesn't like me to buy gift cards to,
This is the money.
to like thank volunteers or things like that. So I just wanted to know what in our budget is kosher to use for, raising funds.
So good. So that question is asking about the usage of funds and something that was embedded in there. First, there are two different sets of policies, right? One is the IRS's regulations, the Internal Revenue Service, that manages our tax code here. The IRS versus the church, right? And so on top of the IRS codes, the church can have its own policies and procedures, right? So just because the IRS says we can do something, that doesn't mean that we can do it in the church and utilize the name Adventist Community Service, right? And so we've got two things going on. So the first question will be, what is the church's policies? And ask them to kind of write out what those policies are. But the reason that I really wanted to make sure that you asked that question in this format for everyone to hear is because there's another thing that's happening there. And that is, you mentioned wanting to say thank you to volunteers using funds that were raised. And I'm going to assume that those funds were raised in a general sense. And so it was a general fundraising for annual fund, right? And so there's a question then in that there's a level, and we need to double check that level, but I think it changes. But I think that it's basically at the $50 level where people are supposed to then start claiming that, and some different accounting has to start happening. And when you give people more than $600, again, that's another hurdle that starts to come in. So where we get into problems is this, and this is why I wanted the question out there. We can't just give people, we've all been there, let's just send the pastor on this trip. We raised $1,000, here's the envelope. It's well-intentioned, but it's really not legal, right? It's done in that way, right? So what we want to understand and take away from our standpoint is this. When people have given you funds, and they're non-restricted funds, because restricted funds, we've already said, have to be used exactly for the purpose that they were raised. When they're non-restricted funds, my kind of heuristic for you is don't give a gift over $50, and you're going to be safe. As long as your church is okay with your giving up to $50. If they're not, you're wasting your time trying to fight it. Just understand that's the policy and do something smaller. And there are creative ways that you could do things for them below that as well. A lot of times people will say, just keep those funds in, and I'd rather it go toward the cause. And you can thank them in other ways, right? So that was a great question, okay? You're welcome. And you also raised a question. And tell me, remind us of your question.
been a good time for us for donations. I mean, they were rising, or they were decreasing right now, or they are decreasing right now.
Yes. Good. Thanks. So the question is this a good time to be fundraising? And the good thing is that when we look at the trend for fundraising, it's actually been going up. Now, what's been going down is the proportion given to religion, right? Meaning, not necessarily even that the dollar amounts are going down each year, but that when we look at the whole pie, the percentage is decreasing. So the direct answer to your question is, yes, it's still a good time to fundraise. And I heard someone say it's always a good time to fundraise, which is true. Funds are going up still, right? And even if the trend was going down, you kind of look at where you are and you think about things like this. Do I have more people giving than last year or fewer people? Is the average gift, when I add them all up and divide by the number of people that we have, is the average gift going up or going down? And that's what we really want to focus on. But it's still a strong time. I didn't show you that grid, but it's still a strong growth that you're seeing in terms of fundraising. Generally, it's still been trending up. On occasion, you'll have some years where you're going to see a little blip. But if you look at the longer trend over multiple years for that small segment kind of moving that way, moving averages, it's going up. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Okay.
Within our budget, our yearly budget for that department, let's say it's $1,300, right? Can the board meeting, can the church board meeting
Yes.
take away our budget?
I knew where you were going. I was just being polite.
And then let us just use our fundraising?
Yes.
This has a policy, we follow the policies and procedures. We say that each department is supposed to get a budget, and it's supposed to.
I totally understand the question, and the answer is still yes. Now, let me help you with that, though. I said the answer is yes, they can absolutely decrease the budget. I think this is what the question's getting to. Because I remember being a ministry leader, and I said, wait a minute. You're telling me that we have a combined budget, and you tell me that my budget is X. And so I go out, and people are handing me checks, and I don't want them handing me checks for this ministry. I want it going to the church, first off, because I don't want the church to think I'm doing anything with their money, right? The church body. And so they're writing checks in, and they're saying yes. And so for every dollar that I raised, they were decreasing my budget, because that was the policy that they had established. What they established was that through the combined giving, and this isn't overarching NAD policy or any of that, this is local church. Many local churches will say, we have established a combined budget, and in that combined budget, then we are allocating this amount. And we don't want any fundraising going on within the church, so we're allocating this amount because our fundraising is going to be, please give to the local budget, right? Some churches will say if you go above that, you need more than that, then you need to fundraise. So it's up to the local church. And we know. So what I want to be very careful about is that we recognize that we're not fundraising for our project. We're fundraising as part of the Worldwide Church of Seventh-day Adventists in this local congregation to do this project. And so we have to abide by whatever it is that they're saying are the policies and procedures that are voted in. And if we feel like those policies and procedures are unfair, or we disagree with that and think that they need to be updated, then we've got to go to the board and work with the board to change those things. But yes, they can. But I wanted to explain that long-winded answer so that you understood why they're doing that. Because really they're trying to fund everything and make sure that everything is getting funded. And thinking, okay, now we're going to do one centralized fundraising so that people don't feel like they were nickel and dime to death, right? So that's the answer. I know. But we do the most that we can with everyone, right? And I get it. You know, I understand. Okay.
Let's say we use the whole fundraise, right?
Mm-hmm.
We end out of the year, we raise 15, we use 10, we have 5 left.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now, there's some churches policy.
I can answer now. Or I can be polite.
They say, we start a new year, we start with 0.
Mhm.
So what happens with those $5,000 that was raised have nothing to do, and on top of that, you took away my money.
Okay. So, and that's a good question too, because these are all real. Yeah, these are all real great questions, because what you're really saying, what I hear you saying is this. First, you understood that they were doing zero-based fundraising. So in other words, what she's saying is, I've raised a certain amount of money. At the end of the year, the Treasury is going to say it goes to 0. That's called zero-based budgeting, right? You're starting at a point of 0 and you kind of move forward each year. Why would anybody do that, you would say, right? The purpose of a nonprofit organization is not to build a huge trust fund, is it? The purpose is to utilize those funds to do, in our case, we would say ministry. If we're outside, we're going to say to do public good, right? That's right, so you're providing services. So they're letting you know in advance. Now, the problem would be if we didn't let them know in advance, then people should really be upset. But if we know in advance, what they're really saying is, look, we're going to be doing zero-based budgeting, and at the beginning of the year, we're going to take everyone to the same point, and we are going to start afresh. You're free to spend those funds as we approve those funds to be spent. You're free to do that, but we're going to start over at 0. Yeah. So you say what becomes, yeah. The donations, I didn't hear that those were restricted funds. Well, but just because it's community service that raised money doesn't mean that that's a restricted fund. Restricted fund means when community service, when you as a community service representative raise the funds, you said it's going for this particular project, right? So now let's do this. Let's do this. I mean, this is good because this is a hot button. So here's what's happening. We've got funds that are given to the departments, right? And it was part of those funds, right? So now there's a certain amount of funds that were not restricted that are moved into this department, right? And now you've raised some restricted funds as well, right? What we're really wanting in this room, I think what people are generally wanting is, let's spend the general funds first and then spend the restricted funds. But the Treasury does not have to do that, right? And so they're only restricted funds if they were raised for a restricted purpose. It's not the group that makes it restricted. It's the purpose for which you solicited the funds. So now, if we said these funds are for Oshkosh, then they cannot be redeployed. And if you raised $10,000 for Oshkosh in restricted funds and you only spent $5,000, then the rest will be there and it will roll over. Now, what will Treasury probably do? I'm guessing they might just reduce your budget for next year by that same amount, right? Because they're not trying to be punitive. If you think about what's happening, all they're really trying to do is make sure that we're utilizing the funds and people don't say we're giving all this money to the church and nothing's being done, right? That's what they're really trying to do. So that's just kind of a part of it.
From a fundraiser standpoint, my concern is that one owner may feel like I gave money for community service and it got used for something else that I didn't intend.
Right, and so you said, would you repeat that again?
As a fundraiser, my concern is that my donors may feel I gave money for community service and it got used for some other purpose.
Now, and that's
Or I won't give anymore.
yeah, and that would be a good point if I'm not letting them know what's happening with the funds, which I should be doing. So let's say as a fundraiser, I have raised that $15,000. If I haven't spent $15,000, I have some explaining to do. And they should feel exactly like you're talking about. But if I have spent more than $15,000, which is what we were talking about here, right? I've spent more than was raised from a donor with a restricted fund, but I've spent less than my overarching budget. They don't even know what my overarching budget is unless I tell them. So if I stir that pot, well, that's on me then, right? So they won't even know. So to get around the challenge that you have out there is to say this: look, we really appreciate your gift. We're acknowledging of $5,000. Thank you so much. We've done the thank you and the acknowledgement now. Here's your receipt. And just wanted you to know how this gift is being used right now. That's the cultivation of that relationship that I was talking about. When I said before, a couple of times I mentioned affirming the donation. We want to let people know how those funds are being utilized, or you're absolutely right. They're going to feel like I gave to something and it's not even being used for what I gave for, which would be illegal, right? Yes. Oh. Well, let's go with Mike.
I am also kind of speechless because some people might send me money from Miami for community service. And you're saying that if I don't, and so I'm trying to build up a little fund, for my community service. And I was even thinking about, because I know these people could do it, asking them to automatically send me X amount, a month, and to work with a shelter or whatever. And so you're saying that it could just be reversed. How would that feel? Because these are people that are not even religious. They want to do it because they want to help in the community, but they do not feel, that it should go back to the church and use in a churchly way,
Right, and just to be clear, and I know that you're going to say something, but just to be clear, we're not saying that they've taken those funds and they use it for something else. If I have a budget of $1,000 and I have raised $500, if I spent $500, I've spent $500 for community service. The church may have given additional monies on top of that to say you could do more things, but that's how I got to 1,000. It was more than the amount that person gave. So their funds were used for that particular reason. And it's not saying they're definitely going to take these things, but yes, the process is that they're taking that out of what the church had given to supplement your budget. And they can make the choice to leave it there or not leave it there. They can adjust budgets at any point in time, right? But usually, if I told you I'm a straight shooter, right? We know at the beginning of the year exactly how the budgets are managed, don't we? Now, we may wish that it was managed differently, but we know beforehand. It's kind of like a contract. I know exactly what I'm doing. It's like when we get to the grants. We know exactly what the requirements are beforehand. There are no surprises midway. So my suggestion to you really is work with the treasurer, work with the board, and talk with them about what those policies and procedures are before you even start fundraising.
In regards to the procedure, I think we're all here to be educated in regards the procedure for budgeting and so on. Would that be okay in regards to the accounts, especially the Adventist Community Services and all the issues they are raising? For example, you mentioned specific projects under Adventist Community Services at the local church. I believe the treasurers, they can create sub-accounts under community services, and the money they can be restricted for that specific project.
Absolutely.
They will give $500 for food pantry.
That's right.
Okay, and the money will go to the sub-account food pantry.
That's right.
And that money, should be rolled over if it's not used on that specific.
That money has to be rolled over.
Yes.
It
has
must,
to be.
yes.
And
Because
when-
that's the restricted fund that I'm talking
Exactly.
about.
When they donate for Adventist Community Services, general donation, but
Mhm.
we should create specific projects. That's why we are here. To create specific projects and ministries under community services. And the money donated, they cannot take away.
That's right.
To be rolled over.
And even if you defined that restriction as this is going to be a community service, we're raising money for community service projects, then that is what it's restricted for. But they don't have to add on top of that, right? But they have to give you that amount, right? And I think generally people want to do that. They're not trying to withhold. Yes.
My pastor always says the same thing. But on top of that, one of the problems that we're having here is when non-Christians or individuals give to community service because of your outreach project, and only to find out that that money has been used for operation. And that's a fact in our church. When you have that zero balance at the end of the year, where the church is running in the deficit, and that money that was collected, they withdraw that $300 that they gave you at the beginning of the year, because they have a zero balance. So they allocated $3,000 for community service. But community service fundraised $5,000. They spend that, so they have some money left. So they take back the $3,000 for zero balance.
Right.
Plus the $2,000 that would have been left from the donation. That goes back into the operational fund. That is the part that the leaders are having a problem with.
Yeah.
Because they're budgeting that as to go forward for next year as part of our ongoing operation for next year.
Right.
Only to realize that somebody gave it for the intent of community service, it goes back to church operation.
Right.
That is the scene.
And what I'm saying here, just understand that what you just described is a different scenario than each of those other ones described. If what you're describing happens, then I suggest that you talk to the treasurer and remind them just these words. We raised $5,000 in restricted funds for these projects. It's not the people in this room that restrict the funds. It's not the treasurer that restricts the funds. By law, it's who that restricts it? The donor, that's right, because those are public funds, right? It's the donor that restricts it. And so I've been in congregations where I've said, oh no, you cannot just redeploy the capital campaign funds because all of a sudden you feel like you don't want to do this project. Now you need to reach back to those donors and reach out to them and ask them if you can redeploy those, right? So again, right, so again, that's going to be a conversation that you want to have with Treasury. But understand that it's the donor that restricts funds, not the organization.
Yeah, I think that it's a very important point, and then what we need to do is educate the donors. Because if the donors give to the community service an amount of money, it's for general. I mean, general is for the department, right? But
Right.
If they know that they are donating for a specific project, so that way they for sure are gonna know, I mean, those funds are gonna use for that. So we need to educate the donors. For
Right.
donating for a specific thing, and that way we can deal with the treasury, I mean, about, okay, those funds are for a specific, topic. So
Yes, and
we
you-
need to educate the
And you can, and I will tell you that you probably want to use restricted funds in a very limited fashion. You want to use that strategy in a limited fashion. I'll tell you why. So you raise funds. I was in a church that was wonderful at raising restricted funds for Pathfinders to do things. Pathfinders was carrying a budget over year to year, $30,000. They were fantastic at being able to do that. But guess what? They were having problems paying the light bill. Right? Oh, and they raised money for Oshkosh, right? And Oshkosh is Pathfinder Camporee, where all of them come together. And so they raised for that particular purpose for Pathfinders. And that came and went. And they went, and it was great. But now they needed new drums. But there was no money in the general fund for Pathfinders. But there was a lot of money for Oshkosh. So that means now they've got to fundraise for these drums because this money is sitting in the wrong account. You see where this kind of gets a little hairy if you start using? So you want to use that on things that really make sense. It's not about protecting the budget. The budget's protected if you raise the funds for Adventist Community Service and you're very clear about it. And then to your point, absolutely they're restricted within community services anyway at that point, right? But that's it. And I think we can probably move on because I know that we've got issues with this. But let me just say that it's not just our local church or the World Church or the North American Division. I'm telling you, this is how nonprofit work works. The IRS sets up the regulations for what's restricted, what's not, and how those funds are utilized. The church has to comply. The church decides how they're going to use any additional funds that they put in that are non-restricted, right? And they let us know in advance. So my experience anyway has been that if we work with Treasury and we let them know what's going on, generally we've been able to get to a point that made sense. For instance, I literally did say, okay, so if you're going to just reduce my budget, then I don't need to do any more fundraising, right? And, praise God, the treasurer felt like that probably wasn't a good idea. And they said, within this amount, which makes sense then. That's great. But I understand, and the important thing that I want to emphasize is that the Treasury nor the church was trying to be punitive. They're trying to just manage funds for a bunch of different ministries that have a lot of needs. And if we are more focused on making sure that we're increasing not just our bucket, but that we're increasing the bucket for ministry within the organization that we all practice out of, our local congregations, these problems start to go away. This is a scarcity mentality, but God's mentality is not a mentality of scarcity. He said, I own the cattle on 1,000 hills, right? If I had a need, even, Nahum, I wouldn't ask you, you couldn't even solve it, right? So these are stewardship opportunities for us, and if we just focus on money, I think it's easy to lose sight of that really this is about ministry and participation in ministry, all right? So with that, we're going to move forward, unless you guys want to stay till like 7 or 8 and hang out. Oh, okay, then. We probably want to move forward, because I'll do what the group wants. My plane doesn't leave this evening. Okay? It's good discussion. It's something that we need to have, and I'm glad that you all were very honest about those things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this part, because I talked earlier about what the church board's responsibilities really are, and that we wanted to provide the gas for the organization, the gas being what? Governance, ambassadorship, sustainability. I like things when they're really just simple. So the rest of these, it's great for the future, but just know that's where we are. So in summary, we want to say that boards are responsible for governance and sustainability, fundraising is a process, and that it's about cultivating relationships. It's not about money, it's about the relationships. And that fundraising is financial support for a cause, so we have to be able to articulate our cause. And then we need to make a case for why people are going to support that cause. And my point is that fundraising is stewardship if you're doing Christian fundraising. And that you're fundraising leaders. We're stewardship leaders. That moves us into writing grant proposals. All right. Now, when we're writing proposals for grants, a lot of what we've already covered has to be utilized, right? One of the things that we want to make sure of is, someone had mentioned before, speaking the language. A common mistake is to say, and it's a small mistake amongst us, but when you're talking to a funder, it might not be. When we say someone is writing a grant, what we really mean is that they're writing a grant proposal. It's the proposal that we write, right? The grantor is the one that administers the grant, right? So we're not giving the money away, then we're not writing a grant. We're writing a grant proposal, okay? And so that's why we talk about writing grant proposals right here. So there are a couple of different search engines that we use in order And these aren't in your page because they're just screen grabs, so I didn't have to worry about having internet to go there. There are a couple of different search engines that PSI uses. So how can PSI help? Will PSI write the grant proposal? No, we can't write the proposal for you. It's taken on by the individual organization, by ACS. But you know, that brings up a good point too. Because when we think about applying for grants, I was explaining to someone earlier that, you know, it's interesting in how we've organized our church, and that the local churches roll up into the conferences, that roll up into the unions, into the division, and all those divisions roll up into the worldwide church, and that's who actually has the 501c3. So we all ride underneath that 501c3. Now, on occasion, you'll have some other people that will apply for 501s, and that question came up on the side. And I'll just tell you that Dr. Kwan probably is going to tell you that it's the position of the North American Division. It's their policy that we not establish separate 501c3 organizations for fundraising. Now, people do that establishment sometimes, or have done it before, and it's been allowed before, because they think, well, you know, there are certain organizations that won't give to my organization because my organization that's sponsoring me as an ACS group is a church, and they won't give to churches. Generally, if the services are available, openly available, and you explain that this is not for the establishment of religion or for the propagation of religion, which is what the local church body does, then they're okay with that. And I can tell you that I've had people that said they don't give to nonprofit organizations, foundations even, that we don't give to religious organizations, but they're able to participate in the fundraising online for the church school, because I set aside and said, we have open enrollment, and that means that anyone can attend. They don't have to be Seventh-day Adventist. They don't have to be Christian, really, to enter into our schools. We have open enrollment. It's openly available to everyone. And when they understood that, then they said, okay, and yes, do we teach religion classes? Absolutely we do. Right? So that's the first thing. The second thing the second point I want to make around that is this. There are multiple ACS groups represented here today, all folding up underneath an umbrella ACS group, right? So when we start writing proposals, grant proposals, two questions are going to come up. Probably one is, who's going to write it? And who has the authority to send it out? Because the local congregation actually doesn't own the name Adventist Community Service. This is not just a kind of a fun legal thing. When we go out and we're raising funds for XYZ church, local church, that local church bears the risk for everything that we do correctly or incorrectly, right? Whether it was on purpose or not. They're responsible by law because they allowed you to use the name. And you can see how it starts to go up. And the conference is responsible because the conference allowed that local church to use the name. And the division's responsible because the division allowed the union to use the name. So, and I know there are some wonderful lawyers in the house. But if you're a lawyer and you're going to sue someone, are you going to sue the person with the least amount of money? So you see where the risk starts to go. So that's why we're talking about these sorts of things, right? And thinking about, just understand that by using the name, it's wonderful. We can leverage that name and we can do many powerful things that we couldn't do if we had to do the ministries on our own. But understand that there are certain risks that occur with that as well. So when we think about things like grant proposal writing, you might not think about risk with that. But I'll say this. What you need to do is make sure that in whatever conference that you're in, that there's a common understanding with the conference about who is able to write grant proposals, what's the process, the policies and procedures that we want to start putting into place to review those. And now that I talked about risks and risk management, then you probably can appreciate why I'm saying these things, right? So now this proposal is going out that Sister Sally has written, and she has poured her heart into it. And when it goes out, maybe it doesn't have all of the components that it really needed. Maybe it didn't really present itself the way that we wanted it to. Maybe she could have gotten more help, by submitting this to a broader group to approve before actually asking for funding, right? And so what I'm going to encourage you to do is to make sure that you are at least coordinating with the conference when you're thinking about grant proposals for multiple reasons. Suppose that you are planning to write a proposal to this entity, this foundation, for $5,000, and that's going to carry your entire project. And it just so happens that the conference had been planning to write one for $50,000. Well, you wouldn't know that because you haven't talked with the conference, and the conference hasn't talked with you. It's easier for all of us to facilitate that conversation with the conference and let them know, look, this is what we're planning to do. Here is what we're doing with fundraising. We're going to apply for these grants. We're writing this proposal, and letting them at least see the proposal. The other thing is, just like when I was in the back and someone said, oh, I'm trying to raise money for Pathfinders, and we need to raise XYZ amount, and someone chimed in and said, oh, I raised more than that in a year, like last year or whatever. Well, if the conference knows that, then the conference is able to share those learnings throughout all of these groups, right? And then we're a powerful group working as one. But if everyone is doing their own thing only, it's hard to coordinate. So that would be my recommendation. I don't know how you feel about that, or if there's anything you want to add, but I would say you definitely want to coordinate, right? And so even as things are coming in through our office, if it's ACS related, I would usually make some mention to Dr. Kwan, not because he wants to micromanage anything, but just so that he knows what we're working on, that we're working on these things, and he has the view that I don't have, right? Oh, yeah, you know what? The Washington group did the same thing. I mean, we have these conversations. We've had them before. So just make sure that you're doing that sort of coordination. Is that okay? Okay. Yes.
I have a question. I don't want to sound like I'm ignorant, but I've heard the term 501c3 mentioned a number of times.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you know what? And that's good because I actually should have said that. So thank you for pointing that out. So the IRS has tons and tons and tons of regulations on tax regulations, right? Many, many, many. And there is one that if you go to the IRS regulations, you can go to regulation 501, subsection C, section C, subsection 3. So you'll see it written as 501, open parenthesis, C, close the parenthesis, then another open parenthesis, 3 and close the parenthesis. I think I said that wrong. 501, and then C in parentheses, and then a 3 in parentheses. So that just tells you the IRS regulation that says you're able to raise funds as a federal charity. And I'm really glad you asked that question because you know what? There are 2 ways to be established as a nonprofit organization. I can be a nonprofit organization. The first thing I always have to do is register with the state that I reside in. The second thing is I've got to register in the states that I fundraise in unless I'm declared as a church, which is the benefit of you all rolling up underneath the church, right? If you had your own individual 501, like I've talked to some people, I can tell you that as soon as you start fundraising on the internet and that email crosses the state line, you need to be registered in that state and the current state. So when I was working in fundraising, we had an attorney that was on retainer in DC, and I lived in Dallas, to make sure that all of our registrations were always in compliance, because if they aren't, you get fined, and you get fined heavily. And they do track it. And it's not an inexpensive process to have to register in all states. It's not like you're just going to put $1,000 out there and you're done. It's really expensive to register in all states, okay? So 501c3 is one type of nonprofit. There are other ones that you hear about, political action groups, PACs, that may be 504 organizations, I believe, and there are a bunch of different classifications. The most common one is 501c3. That's given from the federal government, and it means you can raise money and issue receipts, and that donor can claim those charitable deductions on a federal income tax. That's totally separate from the state registration.
So we're able to raise funds as an organization?
So in this room, we have Adventist Community Service Group, which is a branch of the General Conference cascading all the way down till you get to the local church, right? And so as we're raising funds as a church, right? Now, there are some services that are provided by churches that are provided to the community at large that people will still fund even though the church is providing it, right? And I think I have some examples to show you where that's happening, not in this area, but where it happens by a foundation, just to prove the point. But let me backtrack again on the whole state versus 501c3 registration. Just because someone registers an independent 501c3 through the state does not mean that that is a 501c3. All they've done is registered as a charity in the state. It doesn't have anything to do with income taxes. It has to do with the fact that you're going to return taxes or not return taxes or return a franchise fee to the state. You can't issue receipts that are tax deductible and say that we are a 501c3 organization. All deductibles, all donations are deductible according to the full extent of the law. You can't say that unless you've registered as a 501c3. And that's a big process. Most people in this room will never have to go through that process. It's already been taken care of by working through an established group like ACS. Okay? Yes?
I have a question. Okay. I remember you talking about how some places, some people, donors, may not give to a church, but then because something is open enrollment that the church was actually involved in, they'll give.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so now when dealing with the whole issue of open enrollment, okay, that means that everyone is able to apply and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
In dealing with, being that in 2017, you have people who are transsexual and all kinds of things like that, and, you know, wanting to be treated as a female or a male, you know, which is not what they were born to be. Do we run into a risk in regards to open enrollment and things like that, or in regards to values of the church?
Okay. Yeah, so what I'm hearing in the question is a couple of different things. One is, okay, so when we're saying that we can receive these funds, grant funds is what we're talking about really, that we can receive this grant funding because of open enrollment or open availability of programs to everyone, do we run a risk of having to compromise our values? Okay, so here's the thing. At the beginning of the process, the grantor says, here are the requirements for this grant. And they meticulously have you go down the checklist, checking off that yes, you meet those requirements and you agree with those requirements, right? So the simple thing is, when the grant is awarded, you already have a contract in place. It was that grant proposal and the awarding of the grant letter itself. It's already in place to say this is what you have to do for the year. There are no surprises now mid-year or midway into the grant. So you know beforehand. So if they say, well, you really have to operate that daycare on Saturday morning as well because this indigent community really needs daycare on Saturday morning, do you accept the grant or do you not? No. Can they force you to accept the grant? No. We have to be able to walk away from some things. Now, I'll tell you, this does become a real issue, especially with our schools, and people haven't really thought about it. And this is why we need to diversify our fundraising. So there are academies that are saying, well, you know what, I'm getting my funding, and 90% of my students receive this voucher from the state. I'm going, praise God, but I sure hope you're fundraising on the side because if something changes. Now something's changing. You just mentioned, well, you may have some other issues, transgender bathrooms. Do I have one that's available to students? All of those sorts of things, right? And that means if all of your funding source was tied there, or the majority of it was tied there, you now have an issue, right? But we don't have that issue. We have freedom if we're not encumbered to the government, if we're not encumbered to a major donor, right, and their whims. If we diversify, we don't have this issue. But we always know before we start exactly what the requirements are, okay? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned before in regards to the tax law, to the tax, policy.
Yes.
Let's say this church decided to create, an after-school program. Now, this church belongs to the ACS, I mean,
Yes.
So ACS is here, I'm here, right? And I wanna create my fundraiser. I wanna create, an after-school program. I do all of that. I went and applied for a grant, you know, all of that thing.
Yes.
The moment it comes that I'm affiliated in a certain way with the ACS, who's gonna receive the funds? ACS or the one I'm applying?
Well, when you're applying either at, it matters how it was registered. But really, you're applying possibly through ACS. It matters how you're registered. And that, again, is a good reason that you want to coordinate with the conference. Because you may be applying as that local group, but making it clear that you're writing underneath this 501c3 charter. You're going to have to put the charter on there that it's 501c3. And at that point, that's where the decision's made. However that was registered. And unfortunately, there are different ways that it's registered. Usually with the church, sometimes they have an independent one on occasion. That's not being allowed anymore. Some people have said, well, we'll just do something independently, right? So it matters how it's registered. That's who's applying. And that's who's responsible for managing the funds.
So the management, the funds will go to ACS, and ACS will provide to the person who have created and everything, all the work?
No, because what we're saying is that, so if this is the entity that is been allowed, let's say that, are we talking about a local church's ACS group? So really, those funds are coming in to the treasurer for the local church, right? Because really, it's through the local church it's being applied for. If it was something that, through the conference that Dr. Luis was actually writing the proposal for, the funds are going there. So the funds are going the same place as where the nonprofit status is registered. Okay, wherever the 501 is. That's where the funds are going to. That's who's responsible for managing it. That's who's responsible for reporting and distribution. So when we get to grants, and I know oftentimes people think this is the panacea of fundraising, but remember I showed you that this is a minority of fundraising. Most of your funds are not going to come from these grant sources, right? They're nice supplements to everything else you do. But if you don't have something in place to be able to raise money from individuals, it won't take long before there's a problem, a crisis, right? And that's why I keep talking about people and people's motivations and things, okay? Does that make sense? Well, you have the mic, so we're going to bring it up.
Yes, going back to the after-school program. Here in New York City, we try to apply to the discretionary fund for the...
Okay, I'm sorry. I've got to get you to hold that mic really close and in big voice.
Going back to the after-school program. We
Yes.
try to apply for the discretionary fund from our council district, and the money is available for church programs, right? But they told us that we have to be a 501c. No, to have that.
501c3, yes.
501c3. And we told them, but our conference 501c3 doesn't belong to that district. How we can do in this case?
Now, that was a very complex question. A very good question, though, because I ran into the same issue in working with trying to get some other groups into some of the online fundraising. You guys have heard of Giving Tuesday? Some of you may have heard of that big online fundraising thing. Well, a lot of community foundations run those, and community foundations usually say, we cover XYZ counties or parishes, right? And so we want to know that you're doing over half of your work within our footprint of those. And we're going, okay, that's great. And you've got to be registered doing work there. And going, well, it's good, except, if I'm dealing with a regional conference, there may be 5 or 7 states in there. So one, I'm already outside of the footprint. You see where I'm going with this whole scenario, right? So yeah, you can run into some issues if they're saying that if you're saying that the services you can't apply for that 501 because the church itself doesn't have one, but the church does really. It rides underneath the overarching 501 for the General Conference. What you should probably do is work with your ACS, your director in the conference, and they will know how to get that. It's not a good practice, really and truly, for you to try to figure that out on behalf of ACS. Okay, so if you work with them, then they would be able to go and make the requests and talk to the treasurers and figure out exactly what you should be doing to apply. Yeah.
I know on a fairly regular basis, we get requests for letters at the conference office for people who are working food pantries and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've always been successful in just writing a letter that the X church is part of the sister of the churches of Great New York Conference. Great New York Conference is part of the umbrella. Send them that letter along with a letter from the IRS and the General Conference stating it's all up to one organization.
Exactly, and thank you for that. Exactly right. And so that's why, again, coordinating really helps, because then they're asking up the chain and getting their appropriate paperwork in place. So when I put a school into essentially what was Giving Tuesday, I knew that I needed to start really early as soon as I realized, because I didn't realize initially, before I started working for the denomination itself, I didn't realize that the local church didn't really carry its own 501c3, and that the conference didn't have its own. And that meant that the paperwork really came to the General Conference, and I really had to get the articles of incorporation from the General Conference lawyers, and it came back down through the union and through the conference and to the local church treasurer and then to me so that I could file. Right? So, but that can happen, as I said, they coordinate, but you've got to coordinate with the conference in order for that to happen. It's not that big of a deal, to be honest with you. Pardon? No, ma'am. Okay. All right.
So if you file under the conference's 501c, and we get our grant, we have to specify in there whether it's restricted or, well, say it's non-restricted. Will we run into the problem of them micromanaging that money before it gets to the church?
No.
Because see, it's gonna come in, it'll come in, say my church's name, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and Pastor Luis.
But it'll go straight to our ACS department.
He's going to explain that right now. And I'll just say that anytime a grant is coming in, by default, with it being a grant, it is restricted. Okay.
Okay. I think it is a process, and a different process for each case. Okay. What he was trying to say is, let's try to work in combination for grants, proposals above $5,000. Okay. Let's work together. Local church and ACS. Because there are projects, we may apply for the same thing together, and the funds will go to you anyway. Okay? And for ACS, depending on for example, let's say you are asking 5,000, and I'm going to ask 10,000. We can ask 15,000, and I give 5,000 for you, and I give 10,000. That's one thing. But the discussion here is, let's say you are applying for a grant and a specific project for your church. We work together.
I tell you, oh, maybe you can do this different, maybe you can do that different, or I think you're right. The money requesting is directly for your church, it's not for ACS. I think the issue here is working in combination, because we have to speak the same language. Even myself, a lot of things that I have to do it, I need to go to a corporation. They need to approve me. Everything that I sign specifically, in some case that is legal issues, they need to give me the approval before I go, you know? And I think that's the way the church works. Sometimes take a little longer, but it's safer, you know, in some cases. But as we mentioned before, it is a process. We are learning, we are being educated, and that's the reason you are here. I am here, and he's here, because we need to grow together, right? But basically it's this, there are different kinds of grants, different kinds of projects. You should have your freedom, but we need to work in collaboration. That's pretty much one needs to have.
Amen. Thank you. So good. So we're going. Now it's 4. Dr. Kwan said, make sure you finish at 5:30, Mike. I'm just saying. You got to tell them, I have to listen to the needs of the people. One last one, and we're going to move on.
I heard you earlier, someone asked the question, if you had mentioned, like, for example, you may have an after-school program, or you may have a school, and keeping in line between what you can do and what you can't do in terms of being under a ministry or a church. In other words, if you are open to the community, how much can you do? Like, I heard you say, okay, we have a religious class. Is that something where, like, let's say federal funding would say, well, wait a minute, you can't do that? Or how does that work? I know the Catholic schools do.
Gotcha.
I just want more defined.
That's a good question, because what I'm hearing is, what sorts of things put us in jeopardy of being viewed as propagating religion? If we get rid of the fancy language, what activities put us at risk of really trying to proselytize and do church stuff, as opposed to doing community service? Now, basically what that means for us is, let's say you've got a food pantry. Well, can I, or even better, I'll tell you a real scenario. I was in Houston and I was talking with a guy that wants to set up a prison release center, like a house, a transition house. And he said, I said, well, what's going to go on? Tell me about the programs. Oh, I'm going to make them go to church on Sabbath, and they've got a Bible study. And and his heart is in the right place, right? What he's saying is, look, I'm going to try and address the spiritual issues as well. And I said, well, freeze, because you're not going to be able to do that, right? Because of the way that you've registered, for one, and because you're talking about grant funding for the other. I said, but what you can do is say, we're going to make this van available to you if you want to go to church with us. That's fine. If you don't, that's fine. You can say, as you're giving tours or whatever else, there can be Bible study pamphlets up there. You can't force them to take it in order to get the service. You see the difference?
Yes.
So it can always be available to us, right? Now, when you get into the school, that's the only place that it really gets a little bit different. Because with the school, as part of the academic program, you're studying those things just like people may have to study world religion or not study world religion, right? So that's where there's a slight difference, and with the school, you've also got a code that people that have signed up have agreed to. So they understand that they're going to need to do X, Y, and Z, and it's legal to do it in that instance. In your instance, just don't force things on. The last thing that I'll say on this, and then we'll move on, is that when we apply for a nonprofit status, 501c3 is only one of them. The reason you're hearing so much talk now about religious freedom and, can churches raise money and give more money to politicians, etc., and I'm not going to be political and take a position one way or the other, but what I'll tell you is there is already a designation for nonprofits. It's called a Political Action Committee, PAC. You may have heard them talk about these PACs and super PACs. Those are IRS designations as well because they carry their own number. And I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but I think it's 504 and Bs and all these other things. But there are a lot of different types of registration that you have to be a nonprofit. You have to perform to whatever the paperwork is that you filed to get that nonprofit status. Okay? So just be clear about that. You can't all of a sudden decide, well, but I'm a church. Well, but you have to register a new 501 to do that. You can't just decide all of a sudden that my focus is now education. Well, then you're going to have to amend your charter and amend your bylaws and everything else, and the articles of incorporation and all that stuff. But fortunately for this group, none of that really matters because it should all be going through the 501 that's already in existence. And really and truly, the conversation that we've had in here, you're going to be hard pressed to find an example of where people are running into these issues and not being able to do their programs. Their issues are usually coming in that we just haven't raised enough money to even do our programs. Not that we've got so much that we're losing it. It's generally not it. So I wouldn't worry too much about those things. You hear people talk about them, you hear the bantering, but I really wouldn't worry too much about that. I would worry more about how can I bring in more people to be able to support the work and move on to do this kingdom work. This is the associates. One of the things that PSI does is that we do grant searches on behalf of organizations. And so when those grant searches are happening, you'll see that there are a lot of different ways to do these searches. It's looking for someone that may provide a grant in an interest area that intersects with the things that you want to do, right? And so as a service, as a free service, we provide that, and that's why I said we'll always be going through ACS and saying, look, this is what we're doing this search for, so that they're fully aware, right? But you can see how this is broken down. The whole point here is this. You probably want PSI doing these searches. Yes, you could go to a library. Most major libraries, the main branch will have a foundation center in it. There's usually a foundation center in a major city somewhere in that city. But the key isn't being able to log in and put this information in. The key is knowing how to do that search, right? How to do it so that you get good data back. But I do want you to be thinking about what sorts of things go into the search. And so they're looking right here when we use the associates to do this through the Foundation Center. They're asking, what are the fields of interest? Is it around agriculture and food, around animals and wildlife, arts and humanities, civil rights, community development, common law, all of these things, right? Some of these searches, you can only choose one. Some you can choose multiple. When you call PSI, then we'll actually have you talk with someone that runs these searches, and they'll figure out the best way to fill this out. This you're not going to find because, this is something that is just I've placed in there so that I didn't have to have an internet connection to do a search to show you this. Because I want you to see the visual of, look, this is not really just a simple process to do these searches, right? But be thinking about what are the fields of interest we're looking at. That you have secondary fields, that you want to know about vocational schools and reform houses. This was for something that I had done a real search for another training program where I knew what the projects were for the conference itself, okay? So we can go into things like this and do a search, right? And it spits out something like this from the associates, right? We're saying, okay, well, all of these folk in these areas are giving these amounts, and these are the foundations. So it's not saying go and apply with the One World Fund. It's saying the One World Fund says that they give funding that intersects with the things you've described, okay? And that means that data is going to come back, and that raw data is going to be sent to you all to go through and figure out which ones you need to apply for and to physically go through the application process. The same thing happens with Grant Station, except you'll notice on this, we've got geographic scope And then as we come in here, we've got multiple abilities to be able to select multiple areas, right? So part of that is knowing, well, which of these should I be utilizing to give me the richest search? Again, that's why using a librarian to do these things is really helpful, right? And again, you see kind of the interest areas that come up, and they can allow multiples to do that. Yes? These are both the Associates, which is the Foundation Center, and Grant Station. They're different databases that people pay a license to be able to do an online search, because in the olden days, they would have to go to the library and do all of these searches looking in catalogs. Now you can do all this stuff online, and so these are databases that PSI subscribes to, grant research databases that we subscribe to on behalf of the North American Division to be able to do these searches, okay? So we have access to this. And so we can get certain results out of here where it was really kind of nailing it down. And you saw that long list, but I said when you really get down to what makes sense, well, this was the sort of thing that really made sense for that group. You could see the application deadlines. The areas of interest were there. We have the foundation interest. All of this stuff is coming out, how they make their primary consideration to award the grant. Still getting full listings like we got before, okay? So that's just to show you so that I didn't have to just say we do grant searches for you. I think that kind of goes in one ear, out the other if you haven't seen what that really looks like. So now you're getting a sense for what we're talking about. Ground one, after you have outlined your mission, vision, and all of that stuff, is to A, be able to talk about what your geography is, because most grants are geography bound and limited, and B, is to know what kind of keywords are we needing. So when you say, no, I'm interested in applying for a grant, it's more than I'm interested in applying for a grant. You're going to be primed now to, look, we want to apply for a grant of areas, right, with these interests. And the librarian's going to say, what keywords should we be using? We'll be thinking about what those keywords are based on the programs and services that you're running, based on the target population that you're going to be serving, that you'll know ahead of time now to think through those sorts of things. But the process for writing the grant proposal itself is pretty straightforward, and I'm going to borrow your book again because my numbering is probably going to be incorrect. But there is a section in here, grant proposal writing, chapter 21, and it's going to go through. It has a lot of different examples of things that you will probably want to take note of. So under this section, make a note for yourself that you want to refer to the Successful Fundraising Handbook, chapter 21, for how to write these proposals. Okay? Now, yes. So the first thing we want to do is we're going to be able to make a case, which we already know how to do. What's a case? What does the case basically tell me? It's basically why give? Why now? And what's the impact? Right? Exactly. Why give? Why now? What's the impact? And I could add one little thing on there, which is why me? Because there are other organizations that are doing this as well, right? And that's what's going to happen in the grant proposal. You're going to have to add that portion for sure. And then we want to do the research. And I just showed you the screen where we go through and start doing the grant proposal and the grant research to find grants that may match with our interests, right? So just because the Buffett Foundation is giving money, has given, I don't know how much, millions of dollars away in mentoring programs, I might have missed the fact that, well, the major mentoring program that they're focusing on right now is urban minority girls and mentoring them. So the fact that I have a mentoring program for men, is there a match? No, there's no match. So we want to make sure that we have the research and that we're matching. And then we go through and we make an inquiry. And we can make that inquiry usually in writing. But if you can talk to a person, it's always great. But very often we're going to have to do that in writing just to inquire about what the requirements are, to tell them about what the interest is, maybe to propose what type of project you're going to be doing. And then we actually write the proposal, right? And then we rewrite the proposal and review it. Then we send it, and we always follow up. Those are the basic steps for the grant proposal writing process, right? So what's a proposal? It's a document that speaks on your behalf, the organization's behalf, and it answers all the questions that it's going to generate. You know, we're saying you're going to do this. How are you going to do this? You're going to do this. Why are we going to do this? So it's answering all those questions. And it's supposed to persuade the reader that they should really be investing in the organization, right? So in other words, this is the walking, talking salesman for you to the grant funding agency, right? Because you're more than likely not going to be able to make the case itself. Who reviews the proposal? Well, we can have foundations, and we listed those types of foundations before. Governments, businesses sometimes award grants. Various association groups award grants. Churches, federations, a lot of different types of organizations review these proposals. So where I want to slow down just a little is this, because we kind of touched this. Well, Brother Brown, I heard that if we accept these grant funds, that they're going to come in and they're going to tell us that we can't keep Sabbath anymore, right? So we shouldn't, and as a matter of fact, I was just visiting, literally, before I came here. I was in Atlanta visiting with a group, and that was one of the questions. I was pulled aside and said, we've just been arguing about this last night. Can you help us with this? And I said, no, actually, you can accept government money. From the government's website, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, now, of course, a lot of things have changed. I better make sure that's still there. But it says faith-based organizations are eligible to compete for grant funds on the same basis as all other nonprofit governmental organizations. NGOs is what they usually call it outside of the United States, right? Meaning non-government organizations. Decisions about grant applications and awards will be made based solely on the competence, capacity, and actions of the provider, not whether it's secular or faith-based. That's from the government's website, right? And we've got Health and Human Services down here. So just some sites that we can look at, and you do have those URLs. But are we clear on this? That it is not true that as church institutions that we cannot accept grant funds. What I will tell you is that if it's to run evangelism, you're not going to get funding. That's all that's going to happen. They're not even going to offer it to you, right? But if it's to provide services to the community, that's really how philanthropy was born in the United States anyway. Hospitals, I mean, those things were happening because of philanthropic efforts. Education became available to people because of philanthropic efforts. Libraries became available because of philanthropic efforts. All of that stuff was coming out of, and the government starts to support it on an ongoing basis. So are there any examples of what you're talking about, Michael? I mean, do they really give grants? San Francisco Foundation actually has an area that talks about faith-based community partners. And if you know anything about San Francisco, then you know that this alone is pretty remarkable if you think about the environment that they're in. But even in that environment, they list out faith-based community partner mini grants, right? And in that, these are grants that they give that are $5,000 or less. That's what they term mini grants. These are older numbers. I just haven't updated them. But 45 grants totaling $198,000. What I really wanted you to see is not necessarily that, but when you look at names like Agnes Memorial Church of God in Christ, it's the organization that filed and how they filed, right? You couldn't be more blatantly religious than that, right? But the purpose was to establish a pilot program to address the rise of sexual sexually exploited children in Oakland. That doesn't have anything to do with the establishment of religion. It's open to everyone. The amount that they were awarded, $4,000 in Oakland, right? I cut some of the other ones. I had many, many more, but Ada, to support the Women's Citizens Program for Muslim women in the Tenderloin area. So do they have to be Christian only? No, that's why it said faith-based. So just saying, look, we can actually apply for these grants. And where does this grant funding come from anyway? Tax dollars. And where does the government get tax dollars from? From us. So it seems to me that it would be good stewardship to be able to redeploy the money that the Lord has already provided to his people as much as possible, right? Define the need or describe the problem you will solve. That's the first thing we've got to do in making the case, and we've talked about it. What are the outcomes? What are the inherent values? We've covered a lot of that already, so we're not going to stay there. When we talk about essential research, remember I said you've got to know that the interests intersect, that it makes sense. We've got to know what the geographic limitations are. I mentioned that you've got foundations that only operate within given footprints. We need to know what the award size is. If they grant and they say the grant is up to $10,000, no use in writing for 20 because you thought you had a great proposal, they'd go above. They're not going to go above. The size is the size. They want to know that you can. This is all an exercise in the same thing that happens when we apply for college, right? It's an exercise in following the directions and how well we could follow those directions, right? And anything that shows that we can't follow the directions is a very early indicator that that's right, that we probably need to be cut out of the process because we're not going to follow through on the requirements, the lengthy requirements of managing that grant later, okay? Applicant eligibility. What makes me eligible to be able to apply? You know, special population groups of interest. Are they targeting special groups? Like I mentioned, the urban girls when I talked about the foundation that was investing in them. And it could be the church, but we need to know what their target is. And then we need to know things like, are we talking about matching costs where will they supply the funds for the entire program? Do they expect a certain amount of funds to be raised and matched? What particular procedures do they want us to follow? How to make sure we're following those? They tell you exactly what it is. Are there particular deadlines? You know, if we miss the deadline, we miss the deadline. But what if you miss it only by like, 30 minutes? It was due today at midnight, and you turn it in or even it's just 12:01. Yeah, that's it. Late is late. That's right. The plane is, I love that. I'll have to remember that. The plane is leaving without you. That's right. Yes. And we're going to get a mic for you right here.
In dealing with having to go beyond the normal scope, having to deal with conference and so forth, what if we've done our part and, and it's just there's been no communication with the conference or they're behind and so forth. How do we deal with that? There's a lack of communication, how do we deal with that in advance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the first thing that I always do is I'd say, you know what, I want to make sure that everyone understands what the deadlines are. So I'm probably going to use what to shape, because you're talking about expectations management now in the process, right? So what am I going to use to manage the expectations that we have certain deadlines we have to hit? Going to actually make a schedule, right? With deadlines in, I'm letting them know when this is. Now, am I going to just rely on the conference to have to, thank you. Am I going to rely on the conference to have to keep up with those deadlines? No. So I'm going to let them know. Do I let them know the day that I needed feedback? No. I've got to leave enough time for them to do whatever it is they need to do. If they're reviewing the proposal, we need to do that. So you're backing up your timelines from what you get. you're backing those up easily by a quarter, right? At least by 3 months. And that's the time schedule that you're working on, right? And so that's a great way to be able to do that. Just having the dialogue, giving them updates on where you are as you're moving along, that helps people to stay engaged as well. And I think if we're doing just those simple sorts of things that we do in any kind of team-oriented environment where we've got to have multiple people on schedule, then I think things are going to go really well. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that is serious because a few years ago, we were getting a grant for $250,000 to have computers to give services to the community and possibly to do a breakfast program for one of the public schools because the children were obese and we thought that seeing that our health messages are such that we can share that with them at a breakfast, a nice breakfast in the morning that will help those children. And the church voted against it, say that they might lose the ability. You know, so what you share is very, very important. I think we should let everyone know about that there is a government grant, it's tax dollars to go back to the community. It's not something that will cause you to lose a 501c3 building and stuff like that. Education, what you share is very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we'll make sure to keep sharing that. And honestly, when I look at the nearly 80 people in this room, that's why I'm stressing some of those things so much and repeating, because I'm hoping that as you go back to your communities, because you know far more people in this area than I'm going to be able to contact, that you're sharing that message as well, and that you're armed with, well, just go to the website and look at it. And well, if you have an issue, you know what? We don't even have to argue about it. Why don't you just call PSI? Why don't you call the North American Division and ask them if it's okay, so that we can do that? Because you're right. I hear that I haven't done a session where I haven't heard that multiple times. I've never done one where I haven't. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Have any suggestions about two kind of questions I have? The first one, how frequently should we almost steward the conference with how we're using a grant that they helped us to achieve? Like how frequently do we give feedback to them?
Good.
And then also on that same kind of alignment, how would you suggest managing up to the conference to make sure that they're stewarding the foundation or the donor that they got the grant from on our behalf so that we can maybe get it again?
Good. So 2 questions. One was, how often should we basically how often should we be making sure that we're stewarding the conference with appropriate information and nurturing that relationship so that it's moving together as a partnership? And I would say that you probably want to be doing that, and it matters where you are in the process, but it never hurts to bi-weekly, let's say, every 2 weeks, to just say, hey, just wanted you to know that this is what we've done, or just wanted to send a reminder to you that we're going to need X, Y, and Z, right, at this point in time. And so I would do that like bi-weekly, something really simple. It doesn't mean now we need to set up a 30-minute meeting or an hour meeting. No one's going to do that. But you just want to let people know. I think if we think about it like this, if I were the person responsible for this, how frequently would I want to know and need to know? Then it'll help us get to that sort of an answer as well, right? Under time crunch, when you're getting to the end and it's almost time to submit that proposal, you're probably going to be touching base with them weekly, right? You're probably going to put in the timeline, you're probably going to let them know that, look, we're going to be touching base with you and we'll let you know every step of the process where we are. Here's our initial timeline. That alone probably is going to say a lot because most people aren't going to take the time to do it, right? 2, we're going to let you know how we're using it after it's awarded. And here's how we'll know that it's success. And by the way, here is the strategic plan that we have written. Oh, and you know what? We finished our fundraising plan. Just wanted to send it to you so that you're in the loop with it. All of those sorts of things are really just general business practices that you do if you're working with business partners. And so think of it that way. There's something called a stakeholder, and that just means anyone that has a stake in what's happening, right? So shareholders are stakeholders in a company. Management, stakeholders in a company. Employees are stakeholders. Well, we've got a lot of stakeholders when we're here as nonprofits. The public is a stakeholder. That's why we publicly report what we're doing. That's why we have some of those celebration events, right? The conference is a stakeholder because they're responsible for the risk. The local church is a stakeholder. So I personally, if I'm working a project, really and truly working a project, I list out all of my stakeholders. And I list, you can see I kind of like list in matrix, right? I list everything out, and then I put in columns, okay, now what is their information need really going to be? And what is it that they need to do? And who is responsible for that? And what's the deadline date? And I publish that. So even with my clients that were paying me to do the work for them, I'd had the same thing. Copy is coming in at this point. I need you to review at this point. I need to have it back by this point. If I don't have it back by this point, I'm just letting you know that we're probably going to miss your mail date, and if we don't miss your mail date, it's going to cost you a lot of money for us to do it. We managed it all the way through. I didn't wait till the deadline hit. I let them know early. Don't forget, we've got this coming up. So we just want to do those sorts of things and just treat everyone in the process with the respect that we're all equal partners, right? And that one's not trying to take money from the other or micromanage. We're just trying to form a partnership. Does that help? Okay, good. Talked about the fact that there are a lot of sources. Talking to other organizations that have been awarded grants is a great place to start when you're doing research. It's also good to look at the grantor's website and find out who else have they awarded grants to previously. All of those sorts of things. So we've got annual reports. I've already mentioned some of the other, well, all of the others that are on that list. But the whole point is you want to really know what are the requirements for the grant, what types of proposals have been awarded before so that you have something to work with and model from, okay? And then we have the inquiry letter or the letter of intent, usually one page, tells exactly what the objectives are, the title of the project, and this is different than in the capital campaign, right? Same name, but it works differently, right? So just bear that in mind. Suggested follow-up. And the cost, you want to find out. How do you want us to follow up? Do you want that to be an email? The questions that she just asked, do you want that to be an email? Do you want that to be by phone? Will it be okay if I follow up with you? Does it make sense for me to follow up with you in a month to figure out where we are in this process? Those sorts of things. So you're kind of following their lead almost like a dance. And then we've got components of the proposal. And I'm going to take a break right here, and I'm going to say, let's look at chapter 15, and I'm going to actually turn there. I think it was 15 in that book, right? Oh, 21, sorry. Yes, grant proposal writing, 21. Is that right? Yeah, it's kind of funny because in this one it's 12. So I want to make sure I didn't. Yeah. So look for the tab that says grant proposal writing. And it probably is chapter 21 for you. Okay? So when we're looking at this, see, it starts out and we're giving an overarching view of grants, of what the proposal needs to have. When you get onto page 12-2, we start talking about funding sources and things to keep track of, right? Things that we need, right? And that's 12-2 and 12-3. Oh, 21, well, yeah, it matters what the pagination is in there. I'm going to share with you, right? So 21-2 and 21-3, right? So that we've got those general things. And so we're outlining in this exactly what the overarching process really looks like, right? We talk about the telephone contact and what needs to happen there. we start talking about the LOI, or letter of inquiry, right? And we've got all the information listed there. I'm showing this to you so that you know that you can go to this and you're going to see what's in here, as well as what the content needs to be, which starts on 21-6 and goes to 21-7, right? So you see the cover page. You see the abstract or the executive summary, right? So the executive summary is probably going to be 2 pages, maybe 3 pages, summarizing overall what's in there. There's going to be a table of contents so that can be quickly referenced. That we're going to start out with an introduction, and that we're going to set up what I keep talking about, problem solution, right? We set up the problem and we move forward with that. And then what are our objectives? And that's why we talked about objectives before. And goals are also in that. And then we move forward to the proposed solutions. How are we going to do what we're doing, right? That's going to be the body of what we're writing. What's going to be the impact of the grant? That's where I was saying, why does it matter, right? What's the impact? And then the rationale. Why are you doing it this way as opposed to the other way? How are we staffed? Are we appropriately staffed to be able to execute these programs? What particular criteria do they need to have special credentials to be able to exercise this program that we're writing a grant for, a grant proposal for, right? Facilities, do we have the facility in place already, or are we needing new facilities, right? So it's giving you every step of the way exactly the overall content areas of what we're going to need, okay? So you'll make sure that you are looking at these, and it gives examples of everything. As you keep turning, you see examples of what would be in table of contents. We're seeing tons and tons of examples of need statements in there that we can follow on page 21-10, right? So if we've got a grant proposal that we need to write, what I'm suggesting to you is that you go to this book and step by step just start checking off, making sure that we've followed each of those steps, right? At the time that we're going to need to do that. Because it's not until we get to 21-16 that we're talking about the style and the content, right? Oh, 5. Oh. So we've got 20 minutes. 20 minutes left. So we're almost there. Not 5:30, 20 minutes. But that's okay, because a lot of what we need for grants, remember, we covered earlier, because I said it's not a special thing, really, right? It's employing all those things that if we skipped, then we're not in the position to be able to do. So we move on, and we go proposed solution, what's the timeline, the impact of the grant, all those things that are listed that I just read off in there. Making sure that we show future funding. This goes back to the sustainability that I talked about even with the board, right? So a grantor wants to know the same thing. How is this going to be sustainable? They're going to want to know, is your board participating? At what level are they participating? What we want to hear is 100%, right? Are they going to ask how much each board member gave? No. May they ask some intelligent things like, tell me the total amount of donations you've received from the board and the total number of people on the board. That's right. Then they get an average of, okay, well, we get how committed they are. A description of the organization. The 501c3 letter, because when you applied, we had to get that letter. In your case, in most of your cases, that's going to come from the general conference through the conference. The list of the board members. Who are they? Do you have movers and shakers on there, or do you not? You don't always have to have movers and shakers, but you need to have the right people to be able to help the organization to move forward, right? Someone with a marketing mindset, someone with a finance mindset, all those sorts of things.
So this is basically, the list of the board is showing who's involved and what they do, what their expertise is.
Exactly. Because this whole thing, remember, we were saying is a selling document, right? And so if you were making an investment in a company, you'd want to know who the top management was, right? And what their qualifications were, right? And that's what's happening right here. So they're saying, who's on the board? It sure looks nice if, the VP of Chase is sitting on the board. Things like that. But it's not always how it's going to be, right? You're not always going to have a big name on there, and you don't have to. But this is a selling document no matter what. The organizational budget, do we have that listed out? We need audited financial statements that have been audited by a third party. right? Audited financial statements usually, okay? So what do? We're planning ahead. We've done that planning ahead because we spent, yes?
Just back to audited financial statements, most community services programs, ACS, and
Oh, church.
won't be audited.
Yeah, that's true because it's a church.
Get a CPA or what, how they do it?
Well, and that's an even, I'd like that point even broader because most of us are rolling up underneath the church. And so when they're doing that, you have third-party audits that are happening, and it's going to be whatever they're telling you have to have. But you can have a third-party audit that happens within the church is through the, is it GAC, the General Accounting, can't remember. Yeah. So there is an entity within our church that actually audits all of our financial records for internal auditing. That's right, at a conference level. And so as we're going through, they're not auditing as the church. They're doing it at the conference level. The 501 isn't at the church level. It's really at the GC level, right? More than likely. And this is where it gets a little squishy because, again, there are different people in here, and I know that some of them, because I've talked to them, that some have independent 501c3s, some have been told by their conference to set up a 501, right, which is still an independent, and then some are rolling all the way up. So you've got a lot of different things happening in here. So you go to third party, but one of the people you want on your board is, of course, an accountant, a certified public accountant if you can get that, right? And so you'll have to really work with the funders to see what they're going to accept. But by and large, also what can happen is in terms of the audited financials, there may or may not be a relaxing of that because it's church. And the reporting requirements for a church are different than for every other nonprofit organization. Okay? Yes.
So in the event that you have a accountant, a CPA,
Mhm.
an accountant on the board, that person, would it be wrong to use that person to audit?
Third party. And when I'm saying third party, what I mean is they're not part of the organization. They're outside of the organization. So they probably know someone else that could do that auditing for you. Okay? So we've got it there. And the whole point around that audited place is they're not going to just take made-up numbers. They're going to want some validity around that. And how much is going to be dependent upon the funder itself. So we're planning ahead. We're involving others. We're customizing a proposal. We are not sending the same proposal to multiple funders. We are not sending, I have to repeat that even for myself because I can tell you that I remember when I applied for my first job, I did a wonderful mail merge. I had 300 letters going out, all individualized. Resume was going in there, kind of individualized. It was a mass mailing, right? I changed the name. The content was really the same. It worked then, but it won't work here. Because what happens if someone receives it and it's approved and another grantor receives it and they approve it? Yeah, now there's an issue, right? So, and we also just need to make sure that we're really tailoring the information for the reader, right? It's just good practices. Did you raise your hand? Okay, good practices, okay? Oh yes, yes ma'am. Yes, there is. Well, first, we're not going to be in that situation where we received two. Thank you. So the question was, what happens when we're in the situation where we received two? Is there a negative for our rejecting one or turning one down? And we're saying, first, we're not going to be in that position because we all know that we're not going to submit multiples anymore. So we won't even have to worry about it. But for your friends, you would tell your friends, this is a bad thing because now you're going to have to start explaining that either you've done this, you've sent the same thing to multiple people, and these are major donors, right? You might not think about the grantor like that, but this is a major donor. and you've treated them like they weren't a major donor. There was no one-to-one relationship. There wasn't these calls we talked about, making sure we know none of that's happening, right? So you're going to have to now explain why all of a sudden you don't need those funds. And there can only be two answers as to why you don't need those funds. Either your plan was really bad initially and you weren't able to carry through on it, and that's saying something about you for future funding, or you've had a windfall and you don't need the extra money, which also says something, that you don't need the extra money, that you haven't planned for additional capacity and services, et cetera, right? I mean, that's it. The third is what you really don't want to have to say, which is, by the way, I sent the same thing to a lot of people, and I was really just hoping that somebody answered it. So yeah, it's a really, really bad thing, and it's a small, small world. Okay? Because when you're going through and you are submitting these proposals, the grantor is looking at this, when they're reading from their perspective, you're thinking, you are looking for a partner to work with, and if you're looking for more than one partner, you're outlining that. So this is a business relationship we're setting up, right? And that's why, because we're acting like we're not looking for multiple partners when in reality we have been. Okay? And now all of a sudden they have a partner that they did. So my criteria over here is one way. My criteria for the second grantor is this, and they intersect in some parts, but not in all of them. But now I've forced the marriage between these two.
So if you bet that you state that you are looking for more than one partner, and you get a multiple response of donors, it's okay to accept that?
Now, if you have multiple partners, then that means that you should have multiple roles, right? So if what I'm doing is, in order to fund this part of the program, I'm looking for support from this, but I'm also looking for support from this to be able to work in tandem with these programs, that's fine, but it's not the same thing, right? We're not both trying to fund the air conditioners, right? Maybe one is funding the roof repair and the other is funding the air conditioner, and we need both of those things in order for the total project to move forward. So that's still a partnership, but everybody has a distinct role, right? Okay? Make sense? Okay. Okay. And the last part is internal review, and then we do the external review, asking the same questions we've asked over and over again: why, who, and how, right? It's a professional document, so we want to make sure that everything is correct, no typos, none of that stuff. So proofreading, proofreading, proofreading over and over again is the key. Think about who the audience is. Pardon me? The proof, after the person that wrote the proposal or majorly authored pulled it together, because you may have multiple people working on parts of the proposal, after they've completed it and done their own proofreading, then they want to pass that along to someone else that they've identified in that communication process that's going to look at it. Primarily, as I've said, someone that's really good with grammar, that sort of thing. Someone that's written proposals before would be great. Someone that's reviewed proposals before. And now when we're thinking about boards and committees, you could see how we could be thinking about those sorts of things. If grant funding is going to be a major portion of what we're doing, we probably want a board member or two that has had some sort of experience with either proposal writing or reviewing proposals for funding, right? So that's it. No one in a special thing in particular. I've talked about no multiple submissions, just to highlight that one last time. And then that we're going to have a proposal letter. Proposal letter can be issued. It's kind of like the LOI where you're outlining what the project could be. You've already done your research so that you know the types of things that they've tended to fund, and you may propose something in particular that should be funded. And how do you follow up, and should you follow up? Absolutely, and even if they say no to funding, we still follow up. And when you follow up, what might you ask? Sure, are there ways that I could strengthen the proposal? Are there other things that we should have done? Interested in your general feedback on the proposal that was written. They may have said no because they ran out of funds. They may have said no because they didn't see an alignment. They may have said no because they were looking for partnerships, and more grantors are looking to see where nonprofit organizations are working together, and so that they have other partners in place to be able to move forward. They may not have seen a sustainability plan in place. So yes, I know you're asking me for this grant, but I don't see where you're going to keep having funds coming in so that you can remain an ongoing concern. So you want to find out all of those things, and then thank them. And then the next thing is, what are the action steps if you have a grant proposal you need to write? Develop the case, identify the prospective funders, cultivate those funders, develop the proposal, write, rewrite, and then send it. So pretty straightforward, no magic in this. The action steps are for the people in this room that are writing proposals. So it's saying, if you've got a proposal that you need to write, one of the first things is when we look at the development and we're doing the development plan, you might think, should I even be looking for grant funding? Is it possible for me to find funding for a school air conditioning units? There just may be, right? Can I find funding for the elevator in the church? Kind of matters. It matters what's happening in the church, outside of church itself, a church service. And so you want to identify that. So these are our steps that we're taking. Final thing with 6 minutes left is that we've got online events. This is a different online event that I've highlighted, the Georgia Gives. It just kind of gives you an idea that when you're dealing with these sorts of events that are online fundraising events that are similar to Giving Tuesday events, that usually those are run by foundations, and they're an awesome thing to be able to participate in. You will need that 501c3 documentation from the General Conference so that you can submit that, so plan enough time to do that. But these are great because what they do is the donations that are coming in go to the organizations at 100%. So the whole point of the event is that you're bringing in new donors, you're increasing your donations, that sort of thing. So you've got people soliciting through social media and through other vehicles online. They may be calling and asking them to give online. And the contests are run, so 100% of the funds come to you, which doesn't happen usually if you're doing something online, right? Someone's taking a cut for some sort of a management fee. Community foundations don't do that, right? They generally don't do that. And so 100% of the donations are going here. Well, how does the community foundation survive then and are able to run things like this? Because they're also doing their own fundraising in the background, and they have business partners that are investing, that want to be invested in the community. And so these events are really nice because there are prizes given for many things, prizes given for things like the first donor to make a donation. Had a school that received an incremental $1,000 just because someone donated and was the first donor to donate in the event. The school didn't even know the individual. They can't tie to why the person even gave. They don't know what the linkage is, but they gave. But they got an extra $1,000 just for being the first organization to receive a donation. They usually have incentive prizes for who has the most number of new donors. So that helps smaller growing organizations, right? Because if it was just on the dollars raised, a large organization would always win. But they do those also, right? So they have incentives for every type of organization to kind of move things forward. So keep your ears out for opportunities like that. A community foundation is most often the one that's running the giving days. Sometimes they'll call them community giving days. Sometimes they'll say Giving Tuesday. They may call them a bunch of different, Give to the Max Day. It matters where you live as to what they call it. But the whole point is that it's an online event, and it enables you to register your organization, and other organizations are doing the same. And you can talk about your fundraising needs, and then you get out and you raise donors, and you keep the donors. They actually tell you who donated. They don't keep those donors. That doesn't happen when you do text to give. You're working with a phone company, they tell you the dollar amount, right? They're not giving you the donor normally. They're giving you the donation, okay? And with that, this is the other one that I've kind of mentioned, the give to the max. But with that, I'm going to say we have done well to make it through. Covered a lot of material. We have 2 minutes left. My closing slide usually has Maya Angelou saying, now that we know better, do better, right? It's on here. Yes.
Going back to your reviewing the proposal, I've seen a number of things come into our office, not grant proposals, but where a person apparently relied on spell check. Which does a very good thing on checking spelling, but not necessarily whether the word is the appropriate word.
Yes. Yeah, it could be off on grammar for sure, and sometimes it'll give you, if you're using Word, a blue squiggly, but yes, you're absolutely right. So human eyes, definitely. Yes.
What is your opinion about, for example, the Foundation Center? It has free courses for grant proposal writing and for fundraising, and they have webinars also. And they have on-site classes, and they also have through the internet. So is that a good idea if we just want to learn more or get more information, or we should?
Yeah. No. That's perfectly okay. If there is free education available, and it's usually available through a foundation, yes, the free education for a community is usually through the community foundation, and it's oh, they cut me there. I have a big voice. It's available through the foundation committee and through the foundation community foundation. Take advantage of it, absolutely. Okay, always take advantage of it. The reality is, you saw the difference between where we just talked about things in principle versus when we go, okay, now let's sit down and do it. And when you have to sit down and do it, that's when it becomes real. So if I have a proposal that I need to do or that I'm thinking about, even in the future, what I personally would do is start right now like it's a real proposal and start walking through these steps and really start doing it, right? And then the classes can help to refine that. Okay.
What about GoFundMe pages?
Yep, that usually comes up. GoFundMe pages and other crowdsourcing types of things. He said, what about those? And the GoFundMe pages can absolutely be used. You can use the crowdsourcing. If it's the primary source of your raising funds, you're going to have an issue. You can't control the message. The individuals are controlling the message. That can be an issue as well. But it can be a way to rally people and to get more people to help fundraise, right? So you go to a portal, kind of like what I just had up there through the Community Foundation for like a Giving Tuesday sort of event. And it's establishing a portal, but it's really just for one individual. So rather than an organization doing a lot of advertising and public relations to draw traffic to a portal, but like a Giving Tuesday portal or a Community Giving Days portal, the individual has to reach out to their friends on their own and pull them in. So a good thing to include, absolutely. There are lots and lots of tactics that we can use, mobile giving and all that kind of stuff, text to give. All of those things are open to us, but the real question is, why are we doing what we're doing? So it may be a great idea under certain circumstances and maybe not as good of an idea under other circumstances, right? But definitely something that should be in your bailiwick, right? Any other questions or comments?
Thank you.
Okay. Well, my pleasure. Great being here. Thank you so much. God bless.